Ever since my son got married, he always found excuses to keep me away from his house. We only met at coffee shops or restaurants, always with his wife sitting beside him. On Monday morning, he called and said he was leaving on a business trip, but something in his voice made me suspicious. I checked the GPS tracker attached to his car and froze. The vehicle was still at home. That night, I slipped quietly into his house with the spare key I'd held onto. The rooms were dark, completely still. Then I caught sight of a door at the far end of the hallway standing just slightly ajar. And what I found on the other side made me understand that this was no longer simply a fraud investigation. I was now investigating my own son. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. Glad you found your way here today. If this is your first time, tap that subscribe button so the next story comes straight to you. Before we go any further, tell me, where in the world are you listening right now and what time is it there? I always love knowing who's sitting with these stories. A quick note, some elements of this account have been shaped for storytelling, and any resemblance to specific living persons or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath it. Some details have been adjusted for narrative purposes. What matters is the core message I hope stays with you. 60 years old. Alone at my Naperville kitchen table, Monday's Financial Times open in front of me, coffee going cold at my elbow. My son's name appeared in the financial section, and something shifted in my chest, that particular internal click I'd spent 35 years calibrating. The smell of wrongdoing. The article held up Nolan Hale, 32, as one of the brightest CFO talents on Wall Street, Ardwell Capital's newest crown jewel. Pristine numbers, quarterly reports without a blemish. Every paragraph exhaling the kind of institutional credibility that keeps pension funds comfortable. The journalist had him on record, discussing fiduciary duty with the rehearsed ease of someone who'd been coached to sound trustworthy. I closed the paper and laid it flat next to my mug, the same table where Rue used to take her breakfast seat across from me back when she was still here. Rue left us in April 1996, 5 years back now. Her voice still finds me in the still moments. She had a phrase she returned to, spoken with the dread that accumulates in a woman who shares her life with a federal investigator for 3 decades. I'm terrified that one day you'll find a criminal inside our own house. My answer was always the same. A smile. A reassurance that nobody under this roof was capable of getting past me. I was wrong. I reached for my laptop, not the desktop Nolan had watched me use 100 times, but the secondary machine I reserved for one thing only. 3 keystrokes, and I was looking at a hidden directory labeled Case Watch. Inside it, 847 files sorted by date, transaction category, and jurisdiction. 14 months of work, 14 months of running surveillance on my own child. I was not some anxious parent operating on gut feeling. I was a man with 35 years behind him as an IRS supervisory special agent. Someone who dismantled 52 major money laundering operations across 7 federal districts, who testified before grand juries in 5 states, who had never walked away from a clean case without an indictment. Retirement had not softened me. If anything, it had refined me, peeled back the procedural layers, and left something sharper underneath. Pure pattern recognition. The kind that fires when numbers won't square with the story being told. The document that started all of this was locked in my floor safe downstairs. A July 2000 SEC filing surfaced while I was cross-checking Nolan's LinkedIn activity. Ardwell Capital Fund 3 Declaration of Principal Officers. There, in standard 12-point black type, sat my name listed as Chairman Emeritus Ardwell Capital, my signature beneath it, forged but executed with an accuracy that was genuinely unsettling. I had no knowledge of Ardwell Capital Fund 3. I had put my name to nothing connected with it. Yet someone had planted my identity at the foundation of a financial structure, and the firm that submitted the filing was the one where my son drew his salary. How many fathers compile a 14-month federal case file on their own son? For a long time, that question circled at 2 a.m. Now it had settled somewhere deeper, lodged in my sternum, like something I'd swallowed and couldn't pass. I moved through the directory. Wire transfer records extracted from public FinCEN databases, corporate registry documents traced through Delaware and the Cayman Islands, location metadata pulled from Nolan's social media posts, coordinates pointing to meetings he had never disclosed to anyone. I'd kept clear of IRS infrastructure. That crosses a line for a retired agent. But public-facing records worked by someone who knows the right sequences and how to cross-reference across sources yield nearly everything you need. My phone lit up at exactly 9:15. Nolan. 2 rings, then I picked up. Same rhythm I always kept. "Hey, Dad?" The voice that came through was polished corporate, The voice of a man who had shed every trace of the kid who used to spread model airplane parts across this same kitchen table. Just wanted to give you a heads up. Celeste and I are flying to Geneva Wednesday emergency partner meetings. Might be dark for a few days. Celeste Dre, CFO before Nolan, currently holding some title involving the words Senior Strategic Advisor. Over the preceding year, I'd logged 63 documented contacts between the two of them. Not one had shown up in any formal Ardwell Capital record. Understood, I said, flat, giving him nothing. And Dad? A beat of silence. The tone shifted barely perceptibly, but I'd spent a career reading those micro-adjustments. Make sure you don't call Celeste this week. She's incredibly stressed and doesn't need distractions. I had never called Celeste full stop in my life. Nolan was aware of that, which told me this wasn't consideration for her schedule. It was a perimeter. Stay back. Don't go near whatever is about to happen. Safe travels, I said. Call over. I crossed to the living room window. The backyard was still heavy with late September light. Rue had put an apple tree in that ground 23 years ago, said she wanted to plant something that would be standing long after we were gone. It was still there. Fruit weighing the branches down. Nobody to pick it. I gave myself 30 seconds. Let the variables arrange themselves. Then I pulled up the tracking app. 8 months earlier, Nolan had parked his Tesla in my driveway after a dinner visit, claimed the battery management system was misbehaving, asked if he could leave it overnight and collect it the following morning. I told him fine. While he slept in his Chicago apartment, I went out and fixed a commercial-grade GPS tracker under the rear bumper, the type defense lawyers deploy on clients awaiting trial. The app opened. A blue dot blinking. I expanded the map. Midtown Chicago, East 47th Street, the underground garage beneath the Sentinel Tower, 47th floor, occupied by Ardwell Capital, where that Tesla sat parked every single business day. The vehicle had not moved in the direction of any airport. Not O'Hare, not Midway, not Joliet. It was exactly where it always was. Geneva apparently could wait. I set the phone on the sill and turned back to the apple tree. 35 years of financial crime work had handed me one principle I treated as absolute. Every large-scale fraud breaks open at a single point where the details stop cohering. A wire transfer with a timestamp 3 minutes out of sequence. Pen pressure inconsistent with a known signature. A departure that the vehicle record refuses to corroborate. The car was still in Midtown. A small thing, except nothing small had ever been small in my experience. Small is where it begins. Pull that loose end and the whole structure comes apart. I photographed the GPS screen, saved the image to the case_watch directory as file 848. Walked back to the kitchen. Poured coffee. Sat down with one question replacing all the others. Had I been building a case against a suspect, or had I already settled somewhere below conscious thought on my son's guilt, and was now simply assembling the proof? File 848. The car hadn't moved. Nolan had said Geneva. The map said Chicago. One of those was false. That afternoon, I went to the home office and lowered myself beside the oak desk. The floor safe went in during 1973, the year I was promoted to supervisory special agent. Right 32, left 18, right 7, 28 years, and the bolt still released with that same dense, clean click. Inside 30 years of Inspector General commendations, a photograph taken with the Attorney General in 1995, and the one document that demonstrated my son had made his father an unwitting instrument of federal fraud. I withdrew the SEC filing, July 2000. Ardwell Capital Fund 3, Declaration of Principal Officers, page 6, line 22. Highlighted in yellow, Garrett Hale, Chairman Emeritus Ardwell, Capital LLC, my signature below the title. Forged, but the forgery was disturbingly faithful. Whoever produced it had studied the exact weight I put behind a pen, the leftward angle I'd developed across 35 years of signing case documents. I had stared at that line 3 times on the morning I first found it. Then I'd sat back and thought about Rue. April 1996. The hospice room at Northwestern Memorial. Her hand in mine, already cold, already light. The fear she'd carried through 30 years of marriage to me, finally spoken aloud, that the work would one day curve back on itself, that the eye I trained on strangers would settle on someone with my name. She said it barely above a breath. That's exactly what terrifies me. You'll be right and it will destroy you. I held her hand and stayed quiet because there was no reassurance left that I could honestly make. I put the filing back on the desk and studied the signature once more. Those outside the profession don't fully grasp what dismantling 52 major money laundering operations actually involves. Each one is its own ecosystem, hundreds of shell entities, offshore accounts, wire transfers, threaded through jurisdictions purpose-built for concealment. My method had always been the same: locate the one detail that can't be explained away, then follow it without flinching. Nolan had not put this together by himself. Either I had badly underestimated my son's capabilities, or there was another hand behind this, someone further back, harder to see. Fabricating that SEC filing had required insider knowledge, how to replicate a signature convincingly enough to survive regulatory scrutiny, how to dress up a fund so it appeared legitimate while serving an entirely different function. Rue had been right about all of it. The one thing she hadn't anticipated was that the name on the target would be Hale. She used to say, "I love the rules of the service more than I love the people in this house." Tonight, seated alone in the office where I'd burned 1,000 evenings over case files instead of attending school plays, those two things had become one and the same. I slid the SEC filing back into the safe and spun the lock. Then I picked up my phone. Judge Alton Greer picked up on the third ring. 71 years old, long retired from the federal bench, my golf partner for 15 years. The one person outside the service I trusted to hear a hypothetical that was never actually hypothetical. "Garrett," his voice carried the unhurried authority of a man who'd spent 40 years pronouncing sentence. "Unusual hour." "Need to walk through something," I said. "Hypothetical." "Naturally." I heard ice move in a glass. Tuesday evening, 8:30, he'd be in his study at the Medina Country Club, working through his nightly scotch. "Go ahead." Retired IRS agent finds his identity was used to establish legal authority at a company he's never encountered. SEC filing names him as chairman emeritus. If he enters the company's premises to collect evidence, what's his criminal exposure? Greer held his silence for 10 seconds. "Unlawful entry is a felony, Garrett. Trespass on private commercial property. State statute, New York, Penal Law Section 140.10. If it ties to a federal fraud under investigation, the U.S. Attorney could stack on 18 U.S.C. 1036 entry by fraud, unless you can demonstrate exigent circumstances or a constructive lawful right of access to the property." Define constructive right of access. If your name appears on filed legal documents designating you as an officer of the entity documents submitted without your knowledge, you could argue you hold a lawful property interest in investigating the fraud. But that's a defense you present to a jury after you've already been arrested, not a get-out-of-jail card. "Understood." Another pause, longer. "Garrett, I don't know what you're contemplating, but if you move on it, your justification needs to be airtight enough to hold before a federal bench. Because if it isn't, you'll be the one looking at indictment." "Appreciate the guidance, Alton." I ended the call and went to the kitchen. The drawer beside the refrigerator held the usual accumulation takeout menus, loose batteries, a watch that hadn't worked in years. Beneath the menus sat a small electronic key fob, black plastic with a silver button, the kind of device luxury apartment buildings issue to residents. I picked it up and turned it over. 2 years ago, Nolan had driven out to Naperville for one of his rare visits. We'd had dinner, forgettable, probably take-out Thai, and he'd left his keys on the counter after drinking too much to drive home. I told him to take an Uber and collect the car in the morning. While he slept in his old bedroom upstairs, I drove his key fob to a 24-hour locksmith in Joliet, who specialized in electronic cloning, commercial grade, the type building management uses for maintenance staff. It cost me $350 in 2 hours. The locksmith didn't ask. I didn't explain. I stood there studying the fob. 2 years old, not 2 days. Premeditation. But I had my justification. The SEC filing bearing my forged signature gave me constructive right of access. I held the cloned key, and in 47 hours Thursday morning at 9:30, a wire transfer would execute that, tied my name permanently to a federal indictment. Unless I walked through a door I had no legitimate business entering. I closed my hand around the fob and looked out at the apple tree through the kitchen window, its branches sagging with fruit Rue would never taste. Wednesday morning I would drive to Chicago and turn my son's stolen identity back on him. Wednesday morning I crossed into the city wearing a navy suit I hadn't touched since my retirement ceremony. The key fob sat in my jacket pocket like a stone. 47 hours until the wire transfer executed. 47 hours to gather evidence or become it. I didn't go in through the main entrance. Not on the first pass. I drove by the Sentinel Tower at 6:45, noted the shift change at the loading dock on the east side, and looped back around. The cloned fob was cold against my fingers inside my coat pocket. 2 years old, not 2 days. Premeditation wearing the mask of preparation. The residential elevator bank served floors 45 through 48 exclusively. No lobby attendant, no Kara Odom, just a biometric panel that read my fob as Nolan Hale, authorized resident, and released the car without hesitation. The elevator climbed. The irony pressed down on my chest like weight. They had inscribed my name on corporate documents to secure their own structure. The fraud had manufactured its own key. I was inside before the motion sensor registered anything. The space was sterile, clinical, staged like a model unit in a development brochure rather than somewhere a person actually existed. No photographs, no disorder, nothing that bore any trace of my son. I didn't announce myself. I moved through the main room with a flashlight held low, the way you move through a space when you have no right to be there. And I had no right. He was my son. That was the only claim left. The revolving glass doors of the Sentinel Tower had deposited me into a corridor of polished granite and steel. And I'd crossed that lobby not as a visitor, uncertain of his standing, but as a man who had walked into hundreds of offices over the years to seize financial records. The security desk stood 20 feet from the entrance, staffed by a receptionist in her mid-20s, composed efficient professional. Kara Odom, per the nameplate. She looked up as I approached. One of thousands of corporate gatekeepers in Midtown who process credentials and move on. Good morning, name and purpose. I placed the business card I'd printed the night before on the counter, custom stock embossed lettering reproduced directly from the forged SEC filing. Garrett Hale, Chairman, Emeritus Ardwell Capital. Garrett Hale visiting the 47th floor. She glanced at the card, then at her monitor. Entered something. Her expression stayed neutral. Identification, please. I handed over my driver's license. She scanned it, matched the name against the card, and gave a small nod. The irony settled heavily, using the stolen identity to pass through the security barrier by lawful means, because Nolan and Celeste had registered my name on corporate documents. Without my consent, that designation had conferred on me what Judge Greer had called constructive right of access. The very fraud that named me as a principal had become the instrument that opened the door. You're cleared, Mr. Hale. 47th floor. Elevators are to your right. I took back my license and crossed the lobby. The elevator ascended without a sound, floor numbers advancing in quiet succession. Through the glass wall, Chicago contracted below, streets compressing to grids, cars reducing to points, figures dissolving into nothing. The doors parted directly into the penthouse. I stepped into a space that was not a home. It was a set constructed for the projection of institutional credibility. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like something from a marketing deck. Dark leather chrome minimalist furniture arranged with the deliberateness of a showroom. The air carried no trace of food, no trace of habitation, just filtered, temperature-controlled emptiness. I moved through the main living area the way I'd moved through crime scenes for 30 years, slowly cataloging everything. No family photographs anywhere. Bookshelves holding only objects chosen for visual symmetry. The kitchen surfaces were bare and untouched, save for a single espresso machine that showed no signs of use. I opened the refrigerator, bottled water and energy drinks arranged like a hotel minibar. This was not where my son lived. This was the facade. A long hallway extended from the living area toward the rear of the penthouse. I walked it and found two separate master suites at opposite ends, each fitted with its own independent digital lock. Not a couple's arrangement, not privacy between partners. This was structural division, two people occupying the same address while keeping the boundary absolute. I returned to the main area and stopped at an executive desk positioned near the windows overlooking the park. Dark mahogany surface, immaculate. Nothing personal on it except one item. A luxury wristwatch rested on a small crystal stand displayed like sculpture. I recognized it before I even reached for it. Patek Philippe. The weight came back to me as soon as I lifted it, substantial without being heavy, that particular density of precision engineering you feel only in the palm. The leather strap had darkened with age, worn smooth along the edges from years of wear. I turned it over. 3 words engraved on the case back, FQ always. Rue had bought this watch in 1971, our 10th anniversary. She'd set it in front of me over breakfast on a Sunday morning. No occasion made of it. Just set the box beside my coffee and said, I bought you a watch because you track other people's time. It's time you monitored your own. I'd worn it every day for 25 years. When she died, I placed it in the floor safe at home alongside her wedding ring and the photograph from our honeymoon in Door County, the safe that only Nolan and I knew the combination to. He had taken it without a word, no mention, no request, just opened my safe sometime after his mother's funeral and removed the one object that anchored me to the years when we'd still functioned as a family. And here it sat on his desk, not worn, not kept close, but displayed a prop communicating sophistication to whoever passed through this corporate shell of a home. I stood there holding it for a long time, looking down at the park 47 floors below. The second hand moved without interruption, flawlessly kept, despite being treated as decor. I thought about the morning Rue had given it to me. The expression on her face when I started to object about the price. The way she'd kissed my forehead and told me, "You're worth expensive things, Garrett. You just never let yourself have them." I set the watch back in its precise position on the marble stand, not because I had no claim to it, not because I'd made my peace with the theft, but because I understood that when the federal charges materialized, the court would need this object exactly where I'd found it. Evidence of character. Evidence of pattern. Evidence that my son hadn't only stolen money, he had stolen memory. I turned from the desk and assessed the rest of the space. No visible safes in the main living area, no filing cabinets, nothing to indicate where Nolan would keep the category of documents that warranted protection. Then I noticed a hallway branching off toward what appeared to be a private office wing on the opposite side of the penthouse. I followed it and discovered a corner study with a window facing Midtown. And there, in the corner, half hidden behind a leather reading chair, sat a floor safe with the door standing slightly ajar. Nolan had left in haste, neglected to spin the dial, or simply assumed no one would make it up to the penthouse while he played out his Geneva fiction. I crouched beside it and pulled the door open the rest of the way. Inside was a navy leather document folder, the kind lawyers bring out for agreements that carry real consequence. I lifted it free and spread it open on the desk. 47 pages. Gold embossed title on the cover, Contractual Marriage Agreement. I settled into the reading chair and started from the beginning, working through it with the same methodical discipline I'd applied to financial fraud documents for 3 decades, page by page, clause by clause, letting nothing slip past without examination. The title page was Spare Contractual Marriage Agreement, dated March 1999, between Nolan Emmett Hale and Celeste Christine Dre. March 1999, 2.5 years before the present moment. 6 months before Nolan had phoned to inform me he was getting married, and would I please not make a scene at the ceremony. I'd taken the coolness in his voice for embarrassment about the short engagement. Now I could hear it for what it was, the register of a man executing a business transaction he had no way to explain to his father. I turned to page 2. The language was precise, clinical, stripped of any gesture toward romance. Celeste Dre, age 37, Chief Financial Officer of Ardwell Capital, hereby retains Nolan Hale, age 29, to serve as her lawful spouse under the laws of New York State for purposes of executing joint financial instruments, co-signing corporate documents, and providing legal spousal privilege in matters of testimony and asset protection. Compensation. $340,000 annually paid in monthly installments of $28,333.33. I stopped and looked out at Midtown stretching toward the East River. $340,000, more than I had cleared in any single year with the IRS. Enough to make a young man override every warning his instincts should have been sending him. I read on. Page 7 laid out Nolan's obligations with the detachment of a facilities contract. He would execute financial instruments as directed by Celeste Dre, without seeking explanation for the source of incoming wire transfers. He would appear at social functions as her spouse on request. He would sustain the outward form of a stable marriage to satisfy the regulatory scrutiny applied to Ardwell Capital's principal officers. He would occupy separate living quarters within the marital residence to preserve personal privacy. Separate living quarters. The 2 locked suites at opposite ends of the hall were not the product of a failing marriage. They were line items in a contract. Page 12 specified that all intimate relations were optional and mutually consensual. Neither party obligated to physical contact beyond appearances requiring credible affection. Page 18 detailed the term 5 years renewable by mutual agreement, terminable by either party on 90 days written notice. How does a CFO with an Ivy League pedigree reduce a marriage to indentured servitude and sign her name to it? The answer came on page 23. Nolan's student loan balance at the time of signing $214,000 accumulated at Northwestern Business School. His base salary at Ardwell Capital before the marriage agreement, $92,000. The contract paid him nearly 4 times that figure and erased his debt within 8 months. My son had sold himself out from under the weight of his own education. I kept reading. Page 27 addressed dispute resolution. Any disagreement over the contract's terms would go to binding arbitration, not public courts. No disclosure of the agreement's existence to any third party except legal counsel operating under attorney-client privilege. Violation of confidentiality constituted immediate breach. Then I came to page 31. The heading read, Indemnification and Liability. I went through it 3 times to be certain I hadn't misread it. Subsection 4, B. In the event Nolan Hale defaults on contractual obligations, threatens disclosure of this agreement, or becomes subject to criminal investigation that may compromise Celeste Dre's legal standing. Celeste Dre retains the absolute and unilateral right to release all documentation of Nolan Hale's activities to relevant federal, state, or regulatory authorities. Said documentation includes but is not limited to wire transfer authorizations bearing Nolan Hale's signature, corporate filings listing Nolan Hale as principal officer, email correspondence demonstrating Nolan Hale's knowledge of and participation in financial transactions, and testimonial evidence of Nolan Hale's decision-making authority. Subsection 4. C. Celeste Dre shall be held harmless and indemnified against any criminal or civil liability arising from Nolan Hale's actions undertaken pursuant to this agreement. Nolan Hale acknowledges that his signature on financial instruments constitutes legal responsibility regardless of the source of instruction, and that employment as contractual spouse does not constitute duress coercion or diminished capacity under applicable law. I set the folder on the desk and let the words hold their shape until they blurred. Page 31. The Indemnity Clause. My son hadn't married a wife. He had executed an employment agreement fitted with a termination clause engineered to ruin him. The architecture was immaculate. Celeste had structured everything so that each wire transfer, each corporate filing, each fraudulent signature carried Nolan's name and his legal authorization. If federal investigators arrived, every thread in the evidence trail ran directly to him. And the contract itself, this precise, devastating document, established that he had been compensated for his role. No duress, no coercion, just a man who had exchanged his signature for $340,000 a year. And if Nolan moved against her, if he threatened to break the confidentiality terms or cooperate with authorities, Celeste held the unconditional right to release everything. She had built a kill switch into the marriage itself. I got up and went to the window, pressing one hand flat against the glass. The city stretched out below, indifferent to the quiet devastation unfolding in rooms like this one across Chicago. Rue had warned me. She'd seen the shape of this 24 years ago when Nolan was 8 years old, and I'd missed his school play because I was testifying in Joliet. One day, she'd said that night as I was apologizing, one day you're going to look up and realize you taught him everything about rules and nothing about why rules exist. Nolan had absorbed the lesson with precision. He'd read the contract, worked through the terms, calculated the financial arithmetic, and signed. Exactly as I'd modeled, analyze the information, weigh the exposure, execute the decision. He had never been taught to ask whether the decision was worth making. I turned back and closed the navy leather folder. There had to be more here. I needed the underlying financial records, the actual wire transfers, the evidence Celeste held positioned above him like a blade. I needed to understand how close to activation that kill switch was. Nolan's private desk sat in the adjacent study. Time to see what else my son had been keeping. I walked through to the study and stood in front of it. The surface was unnaturally ordered, the kind of sterile precision that belongs to a man who has surrendered control of everything except the 6 square feet of mahogany directly in front of him. I opened the center drawer. Inside sat a bundle of legal correspondence clipped together with a black binder clip. I lifted it out and placed it on the desk. The top document bore the seal of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. Temporary restraining order. I read the date first. August 7th, 2001, 6 weeks ago. The text was standard federal language stripped of ambiguity. The court hereby orders the immediate freezing of all personal bank accounts registered under the name Nolan Emmett Hale due to suspected involvement in an ongoing financial fraud scheme currently under investigation by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Total frozen assets, $2,300,000. I set the order down and looked at the date again. August 7th, 6 weeks ago. Nolan had been financially underwater for over a month while keeping the Wall Street performance intact for everyone around him, including me. Behind the court document sat a printed email. No letterhead, plain text on white paper. The sender's address was partially redacted, only the domain visible: defense, council-n.com. The timestamp read Tuesday, September 17th, 4:47 p.m. Yesterday afternoon. 3 sentences. You need to disappear for 72 hours. Do not go to JFK. Stay in the city. I read it twice. Then I checked the wall clock above the desk. 11:07, Wednesday morning. 72 hours. His attorney had told him to go dark for 72 hours. I ran the arithmetic. Wednesday, 11 a.m. plus 72 hours Friday morning at 11. Which meant by Friday morning something was set to occur. Something serious enough that even Nolan's own counsel wanted his client completely unreachable when it arrived. Do not go to JFK. Stay in the city. Nolan hadn't flown to Geneva. The trip was a fabrication from the beginning, which reframed the Monday morning call, the smooth corporate voice, the instruction not to reach Celeste, the reference to emergency partner meetings. All scripted. All designed to keep me at a distance from whatever was about to unfold this week. I folded the email and slipped it into my jacket pocket alongside the key fob. Then I walked back to the penthouse living room and lowered myself onto the leather sofa for the first time since coming through the door. 11:22 a.m. I opened the GPS tracking app on my phone. The blue dot materialized immediately. I zoomed in. Nolan's Tesla Model S wasn't at JFK, wasn't at Joliet, wasn't moving toward any airport. The coordinates placed it on parking level B3 of the Sentinel Tower, 47 floors directly beneath where I was sitting. My son was inside this building right now. I watched the pulsing blue dot and felt the familiar internal shift I'd learned to trust across 3 decades, the moment when isolated data points resolve into a unified picture. Nolan wasn't sheltering in some hotel across town. He was in the lower levels of his own building, moving between floors, or staying in the car, remaining inside the one location where every security guard already knew his face and would never think twice about his presence. My phone vibrated. A text message appeared. Encrypted the green lock icon showing end-to-end security. The sender was an unrecognized number, just a string of digits with no name. The message read, Mr. Hale, I know you're on the 47th floor. Please leave now and call me. Do not touch anything else. 2 initials at the close, CW. I didn't need to work through who they belonged to. Clifton Ward. My former IRS colleague of 30 years, retired 2 years before me. He'd shifted into a consulting practice in Washington and had barely reached out in the past 14 months, one short email the previous Christmas. And yet Clifton knew exactly which floor I was standing on. I got up from the sofa and crossed to the window, looking down at Midtown below traffic, sorting itself through the grid pedestrians, moving through intersections in anonymous streams, the city's machinery operating without any awareness of the quiet catastrophes playing out in rooms above it. 11:24 a.m. How does a retired agent's former partner know to the exact floor where I'm standing at this precise moment? 2 possibilities. Either Clifton was tracking me directly, my phone, my movements, possibly the cloned key fob I'd used to access the building, or he had the Sentinel Tower itself under active federal surveillance, and my appearance on the security logs had triggered an alert that reached him in Washington. Either way, this operation was considerably larger than a private fraud matter. I returned to the study and made one final pass through the penthouse. The sterile furniture, the 2 locked suites at opposite ends of the hall, Rue's watch displayed on the desk like an artifact, the marriage contract in the floor safe, the federal freeze order in Nolan's drawer. My son hadn't simply blundered into trouble. He had entered a structure engineered to absorb him completely, and that structure was now closing around him. I walked out and drew the door shut behind me. It locked automatically, a quiet, definitive click. I pressed the elevator call button and stood looking at my own reflection in the polished steel doors. A 60-year-old retiree with an 847 file directory and 48 hours to do what no father should ever be required to do. The elevator arrived. I stepped in and pressed the lobby button. As the cab descended, I pulled up Clifton's message again. Do not touch anything else. That instruction had come too late. I'd handled the marriage contract. I'd photographed the freeze order before leaving the study. I'd documented the watch, the separate suites, the refrigerator stocked with bottled water and energy drinks arranged like a hotel minibar. I had done the opposite of every instruction Clifton had just sent me. The elevator opened onto the lobby. I walked past the security desk where Kara Odom had cleared me 90 minutes earlier. She didn't look up. I pushed through the revolving doors into the September heat, moved 1 block west, and stopped at the corner of 47th and 6th. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number Clifton had texted from. He picked up on the first ring. "You need to tell me everything you just did in that penthouse." Clifton said no greeting whatsoever. "And you need to tell me right now." I stood on the corner phone against my ear. "Clifton," I said quietly, "I need you to tell me what operation I just walked into." 3 seconds of silence. Then, "The FBI Financial Crimes Unit has had Ardwell Capital under active wiretaps since March, 6 months straight. Rowan Maddox is the primary target. Celeste Dre is the transactional cutout. You walked directly into an active federal surveillance operation. If Celeste has optical coverage in that unit and my read says she does, your face is already in the system." I closed my eyes and let it settle. 6 months of federal wiretaps. Rowan Maddox, a name already indexed in my files but never positioned at the center of the operation. "Why didn't you warn me?" I asked. "I flagged your name on the Ardwell charter back in March. I saw the SEC filing bearing your forged signature and understood precisely what they were assembling. I couldn't break protocol to reach you. If your behavior shifted by a degree, if you stopped going to the grocery store on Thursdays, adjusted your coffee routine, began asking the wrong questions, Maddox would have detected the anomaly, destroyed the digital ledger, and relocated to a jurisdiction we can't reach. I needed you to stay completely ordinary." Clifton had known I was bait. For 6 months he had watched them build the cage around me and stayed silent because the institutional objective required my ignorance. "My son," I said, "is he alive by Friday?" The silence stretched long enough to deliver its own answer. "Garrett," Clifton said at last, his voice carrying the full weight of 30 years working cases side by side. "Nolan is squarely in the path of a federal indictment assembled over 18 months. The grand jury convenes Friday at 10 a.m. If he's still standing when that gavel falls, he'll be standing inside a federal detention facility for the next 20 years. But there are other scenarios where standing stops being an option." "Maddox," I said. "Maddox doesn't leave loose ends." "Your son signed documents that could put Maddox in a supermax for life. The instant Maddox senses the net drawing closed, Nolan becomes a liability requiring a permanent solution." I looked up at the Sentinel Tower rising 47 floors above me, glass and steel holding the September sky. "What did you find in there?" Clifton asked. "Contractual marriage agreement, federal asset freeze from August. A defense attorney email directing Nolan to vanish for 72 hours, and his car is sitting on level B3 of that building right now." "Jesus," Clifton said under his breath. "He's hiding in his own building." "There's more," I said. "I need to walk you through what I found before I left." 11:18 that morning, 12 minutes before I'd exited the penthouse. I'd tested the handle of the last door at the far end of the corridor. Locked. Celeste's private study per the small brass nameplate mounted beside it. I'd used the standard mechanical bypass the IRS taught for unannounced corporate audits. Slim tension wrench rake picked 30 seconds of methodical work. The lock gave way and I stepped inside. The study was smaller than Nolan's, but arranged with considerably more deliberate intent. A localized server tower hummed in the corner, its display showing a live financial transaction dashboard, funds streaming through 7 distinct shell companies. 3 in the Cayman Islands, 2 in Liechtenstein, 2 in Singapore. Each node burned in cold neon blue, showing real-time fund transfers that pulsed across the display like something alive. I'd captured the screen with my phone. Then I'd moved to the desk. Centered on its surface sat a physical accordion folder, the kind attorneys keep for documents that need constant access. The tab read, "Garrett Hale, Chairman Documentation." I opened it with hands that didn't shake. Inside, flawless forgeries of my signature on official letterhead. Board minutes for corporate meetings I had never set foot in. Dated monthly stretching back 14 months. Resolutions I'd never authorized. Letters of recommendation I'd never drafted. A complete fabricated record of my involvement as Chairman Emeritus of Ardwell Capital Fund 3. They no longer needed my physical signature. They had already manufactured it across every document a grand jury would ever ask to see. The earliest forgery was dated August 2000, more than a year back. This wasn't improvised. This was structural. Clifton's voice pulled me back. "What did you find?" "A folder," I said. "Garrett Hale, Chairman Documentation. 14 months of forged board minutes, meeting attendance, corporate resolutions. They've been constructing this frame since last August." Clifton exhaled, slow and deliberate. "That's federal conspiracy with premeditation. If that folder exists, you're not merely a victim of identity theft. You're a designated target in a RICO prosecution." I photographed everything. Then I replaced it in its exact position and locked the door on my way out. "Good. Don't delete those photos, but don't send them to anyone either. If your phone gets subpoenaed, we need to control the discovery timeline." I headed west toward 8th Avenue, putting ground between myself and Sentinel Tower. Clifton, I need the wire transfer architecture. When does the money move? Friday morning, 9:30 a.m., 180 million from Ardwell Capital Fund, 3 through the Cayman Shell structure into a Singapore endpoint that converts to bearer bonds within 90 seconds. Untraceable, irreversible, and perfectly clean on paper because your forged signature authorizes the entire chain. 48 hours, I said. 48 hours before your son either testifies against Maddox from protective custody or becomes a statistic. And 48 hours before your name appears on a federal indictment as the architect of the largest money laundering operation the Southern District has prosecuted in a decade. I stopped walking and pressed my back against the building facade, feeling September heat radiating up through the concrete. What do you need from me? Clifton asked quietly. I need you to tell me whether institutional support exists or whether I'm running this alone. Garrett, he said, and I recognized the careful, measured cadence of a man selecting words that wouldn't generate legal exposure. I can't offer you anything official, but I can tell you that if evidence surfaced that severed the wire transfer before execution, and if that evidence came from a retired IRS agent with an impeccable record who stumbled onto fraud while investigating identity theft well, that would be a very clean prosecution narrative. I understood. Clifton couldn't assist, but he wouldn't stand in my way. 48 hours, I said again. 48 hours. Don't waste them. I ended the call and walked 2 more blocks west, leaving Sentinel Tower behind me. 48 hours to sever the wire. 48 hours to save my son. The clock was running. The espresso bar was half empty at 12:15 on a Wednesday. Enough white noise from the steam wand to bury a conversation, enough distance from the tower to think, and enough proximity to move quickly when the next variable detonated. I took a corner table away from the window, ordered black coffee I had no intention of drinking, and opened my laptop with headphones in place. The screen came up and I navigated to a portal most people don't know exists. IRS Retiree Access Restricted Privileges for Senior Specialists. Active for 24 months post-retirement, reserved for supervisory agents who had handled classified financial intelligence. I had 4 months left before the system locked me out for good. I entered the routing codes I'd memorized from Celeste's server display. The screen loaded in layers, rendering transactional architecture that most financial analysts would need weeks to parse. Ardwell Capital Fund 3 corporate structure automated transfer protocols. There it was. Scheduled event. Automated wire transfer. Date. Friday, September 20th, 2001. Time 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Amount $180 million US. Authorized signatory Garrett Hale. Destination Trail Terminus 14 Elmwood Drive, Naperville, Illinois. 07042. I stared at my home address on the screen. Not a P.O. box, not a corporate suite. My actual house. The place where I'd raised Nolan. The place where Rue had died. The digital trail was engineered to terminate there, constructing an airtight narrative retired IRS agent exploits insider knowledge to launder money through precisely the kind of offshore structure he'd spent 35 years dismantling. The wire transfer operated without human intervention. Fully automated. Friday morning at 11, the system would execute whether or not anyone sat at a keyboard. Once those funds moved, the evidence chain was flawless and irreversible. 47 hours. I looked at the coffee cooling in front of me. 47 hours to stop $180 million from cementing my name to a federal indictment. The espresso machine hissed steam curling in white plumes. Midtown workers ordered lattes and scrolled their phones, indifferent to the quiet catastrophe unfolding at a corner table. I closed the laptop and sat still for 2 minutes, working through the architecture in my head. The wire couldn't be stopped by calling the bank. A court order wouldn't arrive in time. The only way to sever it was to destroy the authorization chain before execution, which meant destroying the forged signature documentation before a grand jury could authenticate it. I left the untouched coffee and walked back toward Sentinel Tower. I needed to retrieve my car from the B1 level and drive to see Judge Greer. I needed a legal framework for what came next. The ground floor lobby churned with corporate workers streaming out for lunch. I pressed the call button for the parking garage elevator and waited, surrounded by the ambient noise of a midday rush. The doors slid open. A young woman stepped out, maybe 26, carrying a small luxury salad container in one hand and a slender document folder in the other. Crisp white blouse, black slacks. Dark hair pulled back tightly in the manner favored by junior associates projecting competence beyond their years. In Chicago's Midtown, she was indistinguishable from thousands of young professionals. But the moment her eyes found mine, there was no hesitation. No stranger assessing stranger pause, no brief confusion about whether we'd met. Her face stayed completely flat as she took me in during the half second it took to step past. Then she spoke low-polished, without breaking stride. "Mr. Hale, Ms. Dre will be back in the city by late afternoon." The elevator doors closed before I could answer. I rode the descending cab alone, my reflection thrown back at me from the polished steel walls. She knew my face. She knew my name. She knew I'd been upstairs. And she wasn't surprised. How does a junior associate I've never encountered recognize me on sight and address me by name without a single beat of hesitation? I processed the encounter at full speed as the elevator dropped through the parking levels. People who display zero emotional variance when facing an anomaly fall into one of two categories: trained assets running a pre-programmed script, intelligence operatives, corporate security, federal agents working undercover, or people who already knew the anomaly was coming. Someone had told her I would be in the building. The doors opened at B1. I walked to my sedan and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, working through what it meant. If she was a trained asset, the opposition's perimeter extended well beyond Celeste. She could be Maddox's operative. She could be FBI surveillance Clifton hadn't disclosed. She could be private security retained to monitor the building. But if she'd been tipped that I was coming, it meant someone had tracked my movements from the moment I walked into Sentinel Tower 90 minutes ago, which meant optical surveillance inside the penthouse, which meant everything I had touched: the marriage contract, the freeze order, ruse documentation folder in Celeste's office had been recorded. I started the engine and threaded through the garage toward the street exit. Her voice replayed in my head. "Ms. Dre will be back in the city by late afternoon." Not a question, not a pleasantry. A message delivered with the precision of someone briefed on exactly what to say when she crossed paths with me. I needed to determine which category she belonged to, and I needed that answer before the 47-hour clock ran out. I merged into traffic and drove west, bypassing Naperville entirely. Judge Greer would be at Medina Country Club by now, settled in the private member lounge with his afternoon tea, the only person outside the service I trusted with the full schematic. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I checked the screen at a red light. "Seren sends her regards. You have 46 hours, RM. You have 46 hours, RM, Rowan Maddox." I read the text while sitting motionless in Chicago traffic. "Seren sends her regards. You have 46 hours, RM. He was keeping count. He'd had eyes on me the whole time. I deleted the message and headed west toward Illinois, giving Naperville a wide berth. The private member lounge at Medina Country Club was vacant at 2:30 on a Wednesday afternoon. Deep leather chairs arranged around dark mahogany tables. No surveillance equipment. No staff coming and going, just two old men and two porcelain cups of tea. Judge Alton Greer occupied his usual chair near the window. I settled across from him and started talking. I laid out the full schematic without pausing: the fraudulent marriage contract, 7 offshore shell companies, forged signatures running back over a year, the automated Friday morning wire transfer, the documentation folder, the 46-hour countdown. Greer listened with fingers laced together, eyes tracing the steam rising from his cup. When I finished, he held his silence for a long moment. "You entered the penthouse without a warrant," he said quietly. "Correct. Using a cloned key manufactured 2 years ago." "Correct. And photographed documents inside a locked private study." "Correct." He lifted his tea and took a measured sip, then returned the cup to the saucer with a crisp click. "Evidence gathered through an unlawful search is fruit of the poisonous tree Garrett. Every photograph you took is legally tainted, unless the Bureau can establish an independent source that would have inevitably led them to those same ledger entries. Your entire investigation is inadmissible in federal court." "I know. Which means if you bring this to the FBI now, Maddox's attorneys file a motion to suppress and they win." I nodded slowly. The legal trap was every bit as sophisticated as the financial one. Greer leaned forward, voice dropping an octave. "Men don't build networks this complex simply to extract money, Garrett. They construct them when they need an absolute shield to absorb the blast. They selected you for that role long before you walked through that door today. The question is whether the Bureau holds enough independent evidence to prosecute without your photographs. Clifton told me they've had wiretaps running since March. Then Clifton's wiretaps are the independent source, but you need a prosecutor who knows how to thread that needle, someone who can absorb your intelligence without contaminating the investigation." He reached inside his jacket and produced a small card handwritten in fountain pen. "Ingrid Bascom, Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York Financial Crimes Unit. The only prosecutor in that building I trust, sharp enough to recognize what you're offering and disciplined enough not to ask how you got it." I took the card and tucked it into my wallet. "Call her tonight," Greer said. "You have 46 hours. Don't spend them trying to be a hero. Hand her the architecture and let the bureau move." "What about my son?" Greer's expression eased slightly. "Your son signed documents that facilitated money laundering. The moment he put his name on that contract, he acquired legal culpability. But if he cooperates, if he testifies against Maddox and Celeste, the AUSA can negotiate terms that keep him alive and out of a supermax. That is the best outcome available to you." I stood and shook his hand. "Thank you, Alton. Be careful, Garrett. Men like Maddox don't leave loose ends. If he's counting down hours, he has a plan for when that clock reaches zero." I walked out into the late afternoon light. Gravel crunched beneath my feet as I crossed the parking lot toward my car. My hand was on the door handle when the phone vibrated. Nadia, my daughter, 27, teaching third grade in Minneapolis, calling with the kind of controlled panic I'd spent years teaching her to suppress. I answered. "Nadia." Her voice came through tight, holding itself together but fraying at the edges. "Dad, I drove down to Naperville over the weekend to collect some old storage boxes. There was an overnight delivery from Wells Fargo mixed in with the junk mail. I assumed it was yours and opened it. I'm sorry, but it's fine. What was it?" "Danya, a quarterly statement, but it's not your account. The primary account holder listed is Rue Hale." I stopped moving. My hand went rigid on the door. "Dad," Nadia's voice caught slightly, "did Mom have an active account I didn't know about? Because according to this statement, the account was opened in October 1998. The current balance is $4.7 million. I stood without moving in the gravel lot. Rue had passed in April 1996. I'd closed every account of hers within 6 months. Every last one had been settled and distributed per her will. October 1998, 2.5 years after she died in the hospice room at Northwestern Memorial. Someone had used my dead wife's social security number to open a corporate routing node. "Dad," Nadia's voice brought me back. "Are you there?" "I'm here." "What is this? Why would someone open an account in Mom's name?" I sat still in the gravel lot as the sun dropped behind the tree line. Nolan had used his mother's name. He had taken the identity of the woman who spent 30 years shielding him, who sat at his bedside when he had pneumonia at age 7, who drove him to Northwestern University for freshman orientation, who told me on her deathbed to forgive him for running cold because Wall Street had trained him to measure love in spreadsheets and turned her into a laundering conduit for Rowan Maddox's syndicate. "Nadia," I said quietly, "I need you to photograph that statement and text it to me right now. Don't mail it, don't put it back in the envelope, photograph every page." "Dad, what's going on?" "Just send me the photographs, I'll call you back within the hour." I ended the call before she could press further. For the first time in 48 hours, I noticed my fingers trembling on the steering wheel. Not fear, rage. 3 decades of it I'd taught myself to lock down in federal courtrooms. I needed to get back to Naperville and build the systematic plan that would protect my son and honor what remained of my wife's memory. I sat in the Medina Country Club parking lot until the shaking subsided. Then I drove home. A single desk lamp lit my Naperville home office at 9 o'clock Wednesday night, throwing light across handwritten financial maps spread over the mahogany surface. No emotional fracture. Pure systematic execution, the same way I had dismantled 52 criminal networks before this one. I applied the exact protocol I'd drilled into junior IRS agents for 3 decades. Assume worst case, work backward from conviction. I pulled out a clean legal pad and wrote 3 strategic objectives in order of priority. 1. Sever the $180 million wire transfer before Friday 11 a.m. 2. Move Nolan into federal protective custody before Rowan Maddox initiated asset cleanup. 3. Secure federal indictments against Celeste Dre and Rowan Maddox. The objectives were fixed. The tactical sequence was what required precision. I picked up the phone and dialed Clifton at 9:45. He answered on the first ring. "Garrett, I need a prepackaged warrant application assembled for AUSA Bascom Prime to trigger the moment I upload Form 3949-A. Can you have it locked by dawn?" "What's the target scope?" "Ardwell Capital Fund 3, all principal officers, all shell company subsidiaries, and freeze orders on every routing account tied to the Cayman structure." Clifton went quiet for 3 seconds. "That's a 100-page application. I'll need to bring in 2 paralegals." "Bring in whoever you need. I'm transmitting the whistleblower form tomorrow afternoon. The moment it hits the IRS portal, Bascom needs that warrant package ready for a judge's signature." "Understood. Meet me at the Evanston Diner tomorrow morning, 7:30. I'll have a status update." I ended the call and looked at the photograph of Rue resting on the desk. It had sat there for 5 years. Same silver frame. Same quiet smile from our anniversary dinner in Door County 28 years ago. She'd always said, "I love the rules of the service more than I love the people in this house." Tonight, those two things had become identical. I didn't know whether that made me a better man or something else entirely. I worked through the night cross-referencing routing codes, mapping shell company hierarchies, documenting the full transactional architecture with the precision of a man who had spent 35 years constructing cases that never failed to secure conviction. At 5 a.m. Thursday, I showered, dressed, and drove west across the city before commuter traffic sealed the arteries. The Evanston Diner occupied a narrow street above the river, grease-stained booths, linoleum floors, no surveillance blind spots populated entirely by dock workers and long-haul truckers who wouldn't recognize a federal investigation if it occupied the next booth. I took the corner table at 7:15 and waited. Clifton arrived at 7:30, sliding into the booth without a glance at the menu. He set his phone face down on the table and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug the waitress poured without being asked. "Bascom reviewed your 14-month file dump last night," he said, skipping any preamble. "She said it's the cleanest evidentiary package she's seen from a civilian source in 5 years. The warrant application is locked, pre-packaged, and ready. The moment you transmit Form 3949-A to the IRS portal, the system fires an automated alert to Bascom's desk. She'll have a federal judge's signature within 4 hours." I nodded once. The first objective was moving. "Nolan," I said, "is he secure for the next 36 hours? Clifton stared into his coffee for a long moment before answering. "Rowan Maddox flew 2 cleaners in from Frankfurt into O'Hare last night. Our airport surveillance team logged them clearing customs at 11:47 p.m. We have eyes on their vehicle, black Mercedes sedan, Illinois rental plates. They're staying at a corporate apartment in River North." The cold calculation I'd learned to trust settled into my chest. Professional assets. Former German federal police turned private contractors, the kind of people who don't leave forensic traces and don't inquire about their target. And the FBI is just watching them. "We can't detain them for entering the country, Garrett. They cleared customs legally. We're tracking their movements, but until they commit a criminal act on U.S. soil, there's no legal basis for detention, which means Nolan is exposed until the moment they move." Clifton leaned forward slightly. "We have surveillance on Sentinel Tower. The second those two cross the perimeter, Tactical gets the alert." "But Garrett," his voice dropped, "Maddox's timeline mirrors yours. He knows the grand jury convenes Friday morning. He knows the wire executes at 11 o'clock. If he's going to eliminate loose threads, it happens in the window before federal warrants lock everything down." Maddox's team was already on the ground in Chicago, and Nolan had no idea. "I need an immediate alert the second those cleaners approach Sentinel Tower's perimeter." "You'll have it. But Garrett, what's your extraction plan? You can't walk into that penthouse and tell Nolan the truth. The moment he knows, his behavior shifts, and if Maddox is watching, I'm not extracting him personally. That's what the warrants are for. The moment Bascom gets the judge's signature, FBI Tactical enters that building under legal authority. They secure Nolan as a material witness, and he goes into protective custody, cooperative or not." Clifton studied me from across the table. "You're using federal power to protect your son without his consent." "I'm using federal power to execute the prosecution Maddox has been constructing around my name for the past year. Nolan's safety is objective 2. The indictments are objective 3. But all of it depends on severing that wire before it executes tomorrow morning." "When are you filing the 3949-A? EIC. I checked my watch. 7:48 a.m. Thursday, 27 hours until the wire executed. Today, 2 p.m. That gives Bascom until 6 p.m. to secure the warrant signature and gives Tactical overnight to plan the Friday morning breach." Clifton nodded slowly. "It's tight, but it works." I stood from the booth and left cash on the table for both coffees. "One more piece," I said. "I need a Financial Times reporter, a witness shield and press lever, someone who publishes the moment the warrants execute." Clifton pulled a small notepad from his jacket and wrote a name. "Reed Fenner, investigative reporter. Published the only piece that seriously questioned Ardwell's liquidity anomalies 6 months ago. Hand him the story and he'll recognize what he's holding." I took the paper and walked out into the cold Thursday morning. I left the Evanston Diner with Reed Fenner's name on Clifton's notepad and 27 hours until the wire executed. The high-traffic coffee house directly across from the Financial Times newsroom gave me a clear sightline of the main entrance, enough proximity to move fast, enough anonymity to disappear cleanly, exactly the kind of neutral ground where a retired federal investigator could hand a journalist the front page without leaving fingerprints. I took a window table at 10:30 Thursday morning and sent an unlisted text to the number Clifton had provided. "Reed Fenner. I have information regarding Ardwell Capital's offshore architecture. Coffee house across from your building, 15 minutes. 4 minutes later, a man in his late 30s pushed through the door with a digital recorder in one hand and a paper notebook in the other. Reed Fenner, Financial Times investigative reporter, author of the only serious piece challenging Ardwell's liquidity gaps the previous month. Clifton had briefed him as documentation insurance. A concealed lens camera rode in his messenger bag beside the recorder, live audio clipped inside his jacket collar. He swept the room, locked onto me, and crossed directly to my table. No hesitation. The instinct of a journalist who understood he'd just been handed the front page. He sat without being invited and placed the recorder on the table between us, already running. "Who are you?" he asked. "The man who's about to make your career." "That's not a name. You're pursuing the Ardwell offshore yield architecture, correct?" Something tightened slightly around his eyes. Confirmation. "I've been looking at Ardwell Capital Fund 3 for 6 months, Reed said carefully. "Their reported returns don't align with market fundamentals. Either someone's fabricating the numbers or routing capital through jurisdictions built to conceal the source." "Both," I said. "I can't hand you the ledger today, but I'd suggest positioning a camera crew in Chicago on Friday morning, specifically outside Sentinel Tower on East 47th Street. Be there by 9 a.m. "What?" "Federal warrants are about to execute. You'll be the only reporter with a live lens when the doors open." Reed leaned back and studied me. Who am I quoting? I stood from the table and set a $20 bill beside my untouched coffee. "The man who's about to hand you the front page." I walked out before he could ask another question. I didn't need Reed to grasp the underlying mechanics of the fraud. I needed his press credentials and a live lens standing on the pavement when the doors came open. A Financial Times reporter is a witness that even someone like Rowan Maddox cannot make disappear. I drove north out of the city, merging toward Naperville. The plan was on schedule. Reed would be positioned Friday morning. The prepackaged warrant was locked. A USA BASCOM was standing by. All that remained was uploading Form 3949-A to trigger the cascade. My phone rang at 3:45, patched through the vehicle's Bluetooth. The console display showed a number I recognized immediately. Celeste Dre, corporate line. I answered without speaking. "Hello, Garrett." Her voice came through level-controlled, the cadence of someone reciting contract language. "I know you crossed our security perimeter yesterday morning. Saren logged you at 12:35 p.m. I've spent the past 27 hours consulting with internal counsel and finalizing our defensive position." I said nothing. Let her talk. "The reality is straightforward," Celeste continued. "You have no leverage. Whatever you believe you discovered in that penthouse, whatever photographs you took, whatever documents you examined, it's all inadmissible, fruit of the poisonous tree. Your attorney friend should have made that clear." "He did," I said quietly. "Then you understand where you stand. You have exactly 24 hours to withdraw. If you attempt any form of disclosure, if you contact federal authorities, if you speak to the press, if you forward so much as a single email, I activate our contingency protocol, which means Nolan absorbs the full criminal weight of the fund's transactions. Every wire transfer, every shell company authorization, every offshore account, all of it traces to his signature. And you, Garrett, go down as the chairman emeritus who authorized every transfer. We have 14 months of documentation establishing your participation. A grand jury won't need more than an hour." I drove in silence, watching traffic weave and separate around me. Celeste had needed 27 hours to consult counsel and build her defensive position. 27 hours to decide how to threaten me. But when she placed that call at 3:45 Thursday afternoon, my operational files were already set. The prepackaged warrant was locked. A USA BASCOM had reviewed my 14-month evidentiary package and described it as the cleanest civilian source material she'd encountered in 5 years. Celeste believed she was delivering an ultimatum. In fact, she had just confirmed that my targeting coordinates were exact. "Garrett," her voice sharpened slightly, "do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand perfectly." 24 hours. After that, the contingency protocol activates automatically. Nolan goes to prison, you go to prison, and Rowan Maddox walks away clean. That's the only outcome if you push this. "Thank you for calling," I said and cut the line. I drove the rest of the way to Naperville in silence, working through the variables. Celeste knew I had crossed the threshold. Saren Thorne, that impassive figure in the Sentinel Tower lobby, was her surveillance asset inside the building. But there was one variable Celeste had failed to account for. When she initiated that call at 3:45 Thursday afternoon, every element of my operation was already running. The warrant application was locked. Reed Fenner was positioning his camera crew. Clifton had FBI Tactical on standby. What I was about to learn about what my own son had quietly set in motion and how far back it reached is the kind of thing that changes a man's understanding of everything he thought he knew. Before we get there, I want to ask you if someone you loved had been working against you in silence. Would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait until the proof was airtight? Judge Greer had given me the legal architecture I needed. Celeste's 24-hour deadline had missed its window by 27 hours. While she burned a full day in conference with attorneys erecting her defensive position, I'd been moving in the opposite direction, building a federal prosecution package, locking in a Financial Times witness deploying tactical assets ahead of a Friday breach. I turned into my Naperville driveway at 5:30 and killed the engine, staying put for a moment, as the last of the daylight bled out behind the apple tree. One miscalculation had undone her entirely. She'd concluded I was isolated, that a man without a badge and without active jurisdiction would crumble the moment a legal threat landed. 35 years of constructing prosecutions against people who'd made that same assumption had produced a perfect record. I hadn't lost once. Tonight belonged to the final phase, pulling back the curtain on Saren Thorne's real identity, then confirming every coordinate was live before the whistleblower upload triggered the cascade. At 5:30 Thursday evening, I settled into my Naperville home office, Celeste's words still turning in the back of my mind. 24 hours. She had no idea the warrant was already packaged and waiting. She had no idea AUSA Bascom had described my evidentiary file as the most airtight civilian submission she'd reviewed in 5 years. The ultimatum was theater. The curtain had already risen on a different play. Dusk threw amber across my desk as I opened the IRS retiree database and entered the name. Saren Thorne, 26. The woman who had clocked my face in the Sentinel Tower lobby with zero lag, zero uncertainty. The query returned its results slowly. SSN, no record predating 1997. I read what the system gave me. The number linked to Saren Thorne had originally been assigned to a child in Oregon, born 1980, dead by 1982, cause of death a drowning. Someone had harvested that identity off a grave, and the ghost had been walking around Chicago for years. I pulled the employment record from the Sentinel Tower access logs. Education, listed, Northwestern University class of 1995. The registrar had no trace of that name in any enrollment file. Her academic credentials traced back to an unaccredited Pennsylvania institution that had shuttered 10 years prior. I lifted the passport photo from her building access record, fed it into the Interpol Financial Fugitive Database still accessible through my retiree portal, and waited. The name produced nothing. The face produced everything. Red notice subject, Seoul, South Korea, Financial Crimes Division, 1996. The charge orchestrating an asset-stripping scheme against corporate pension funds. She'd gone dark before the arrest warrant reached her. Current designation, international fugitive. I sat back and held the screen in my gaze. There was no Saren Thorne. The person who had been shadowing Celeste's every professional move was an Interpol fugitive running on a stolen identity, the name of a 2-year-old who had drowned before she'd learned to speak. And Celeste had no knowledge of it. The geometry of it resolved cleanly. Celeste was manufacturing a trap around me, the forged marriage contract, Nolan's signatures across the shell documentation. Rowan Maddox was constructing a deeper enclosure around Celeste, routing Saren through her inner circle as a surveillance instrument she'd never consented to. And I was standing outside the whole structure attaching the detonator, 3 cages built inside each other Matryoshka style. I shut the database and remained still in the failing light, working through what it meant. Maddox had seeded a fugitive into Celeste's operation years before my name showed up on a single SEC document. She had cast herself as the engineer of this scheme. The more accurate reading was that she was another monitored variable. Gravel shifted outside. A set of headlights I didn't recognize swept the window as a car rolled into the driveway. Minnesota plates. Nadia. She got out at 7:28 with a folder wedged under her arm, bypassed the doorbell entirely, and came straight through to the kitchen. I was already there when she arrived, standing under the overhead light above the wooden table where Rue had held this family together for 3 decades. Nadia placed the folder flat and pushed a single document across the grain toward me. The Wells Fargo statement. Rue Hale, October 1998. Current balance $4.7 million. I looked at her. Her eyes carried the red of someone who had been holding back tears for 4 hours on the highway without letting them fall. Her jaw was locked in a set I recognized, the same cold, analytical containment I'd honed across a career. She hadn't known she'd inherited it until that moment. "How long have you known about Nolan's accounts?" The question came out even precise, the voice of a woman who'd made the drive from Minneapolis nonstop because a fabricated bank record in her mother's name was not something she could process over the phone. "Since this afternoon," I said, "when you called." And then the rest of it. I dropped my eyes to my hands, then raised them back to her face. For the first time in 48 hours, I walked someone through the full operational picture. Not Clifton, not Judge Greer, not anyone inside the apparatus. My 27-year-old daughter who taught 8-year-olds to read in Minneapolis and had driven across a state line because someone had converted her mother's identity into a financial instrument. I covered everything. The forged SEC filing, 14 months of coordinated surveillance, the marriage contract, binding Nolan to Celeste, the 7 offshore shells, the $180 million wire set to execute Friday at 11, the Frankfurt pair being tailed by FBI surveillance, the pre-packaged warrant sitting ready for a judge's pen, Reed Fenner moving a camera crew into position outside Sentinel Tower. Nadia didn't move while I spoke. Her eyes stayed on mine throughout. When I finished, the silence stretched before she broke it. "What happens to Nolan once this detonates?" I let my gaze drift past her to Rue's photograph on the refrigerator, a shot from Mackinac Island in the summer of 1975. Nolan was 6, crouched over a sandcastle at the waterline. Nadia was an infant asleep against Rue's shoulder, tucked inside her mother's arms. "He stays breathing," I said, "even if he never speaks to me again." Nadia absorbed that. "Then, you're going to demolish everything he's built in order to pull him out?" "Yes." "And you believe that's the choice Mom would make?" I thought of Rue in that hospice room at Northwestern Memorial, her fingers gone cold around mine, admitting she'd lived in fear that I would one day find a criminal inside this house. She had carried that knowledge for years. 5 years before I ever uncovered the SEC filing she'd already known. She told me once that the gravest mistake I could make would be choosing institutional obligations over the people under this roof, I said quietly. She wasn't right about that. The institution is the only protection he has left. If Nolan steps into Friday morning without federal cover, Maddox's contractors take him off the board before the wire clears. FBI tactical getting to him first isn't a betrayal. It's the only play. Nadia's eyes were still red. Her jaw hadn't moved. "Does he know?" she asked. "Does Nolan know what you've set in motion?" "No." "Are you going to tell him?" "Not before it's too late for him to disappear." She rose from the table and crossed to the window. The apple tree Rue had put in the ground 23 years ago stood stripped and dark against the evening. "I came down here expecting you to tell me this was a clerical error," she said, her back still to me, "that someone had lifted Mom's name and you were already cleaning it up. But that's not what this is. You're engineering a federal raid against your own son." "Yes," I said, "I am." She turned. "Then I'm not going anywhere until it's done." Nadia climbed to her childhood bedroom at 9:30. The door latched behind her. The frame giving its familiar creak, a repair I'd been putting off for years, and then the house went quiet. I went back to the office. The financial maps still covered the mahogany. 27 hours to wire execution. 24 until Celeste's window closed. Somewhere inside Sentinel Tower, Nolan was oblivious to the Frankfurt pair that FBI surveillance had been running since they cleared customs. Then at 11 p.m., his name appeared on my screen, bright as a distress signal. I already knew before I answered that the call was going to cost me something. Nolan. What came back was nothing like the composed Wall Street Register I'd heard Monday morning. His voice was frayed, the gaps between words filled with audible breath. "Dad." A pause. I heard him swallow against it. "Dad, whatever you've set in motion, shut it down. Right now. They have the full picture. All of it." "Who does—" "I can't—" A fracture ran through his voice. "I can't get into that. Just stop. I'm asking you. Whatever case you think you're building, whatever documents you're sitting on, walk away from it. Tonight, no calls, no emails. Let it go." I listened to the pattern of his breathing. Quick, compressed. A man with no room left to maneuver. "Nolan," I said quietly, "is there someone in your office with you right now, someone who isn't American?" Silence answered. 5 full seconds. I tracked everyone. Shallow breath on the line, the far-off texture of Chicago traffic drifting up from 47 floors below, wherever Nolan was standing at that moment. Then the connection cut. Clean total, no farewell, just the drop to dead air and the phone sitting in my hand. 30 years working financial crimes at the IRS had calibrated me to what silence signals the exact species of pause that arrives just before a man confirms he has nowhere left to go. The beat a CPA takes before admitting the numbers were always wrong. Nolan's 5 seconds told me everything I needed to know. My son wasn't alone. Rowan Maddox wasn't monitoring from Frankfurt, wasn't running signals through Suresnes. He was physically in that room with Nolan close enough that a direct question couldn't be answered safely. The threat had moved from financial leverage to physical presence. I checked the clock. 11:07 p.m. Celeste's ultimatum expired at 3:45 p.m. Friday, 16 hours and 38 minutes out. She believed she was squeezing. She had no idea I'd settled on my course 48 hours earlier the moment I walked into that penthouse and found Rue's watch displayed on Nolan's desk like a relic behind glass. I opened the laptop and pulled up the IRS criminal investigation portal. The retiree credentials still held. 4 months left before permanent lockout. Over the preceding 14 months, I'd organized 847 files, every wire transfer authorization, every shell company registration, every forged signature carrying my name, every offshore routing code threading Ardwell Capital Fund 3 through the Cayman structure to the Singapore endpoints. I started the upload. The progress bar crawled. File 1 of 847, File 50, File 100. The screen's blue light was the only illumination in the office. Nadia slept upstairs. Naperville was quiet outside the window. 14 minutes and 22 seconds later, the last file went through. I opened Form 3949-A, the information referral document. The IRS whistleblower form I'd seen hundreds of times from the government side, filed by accountants, attorneys, former spouses, business partners who'd stumbled into fraud and wanted federal cover. I completed the fields with the same precision I'd applied to every case I'd ever built. Primary subject, Ardwell Capital Fund 3. Principal officers, Celeste Dre, Nolan Hale. Nature of violation, money laundering, wire fraud, identity theft, offshore tax evasion. Estimated financial impact, $180 million in primary wire transfers, $18 million in secondary trust fund manipulation. Supporting documentation, 847 files attached. My cursor stopped over the submit button. This was the point of no return. Once the form entered the federal system, AUSA BASCOM would receive the automated alert. The prepackaged warrant application would fire. FBI Tactical would begin staging the Friday morning breach. Nothing after this could be walked back. I clicked submit. 63 seconds later, the confirmation arrived. Case number IRS-CI-2001-NY-847. Date received September 20th, 2001, 2:17 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Status under review, Criminal Investigation Division. I leaned back and looked at the timestamp. 2:17 a.m. Celeste's deadline didn't expire until 3:45 p.m., 7 hours and 28 minutes from now. I'd cleared her window by more than 7 hours. When Celeste opened her email and saw a federal case number staring back at her, she would finally understand what I'd recognized since Tuesday. You don't issue a deadline to a man who spent his career mapping how fraudsters think. You don't offer a retired federal investigator 24 hours to stand down when he's already been building the prosecution file for 14 months. Her ultimatum was a bluff. My submission was the call. I looked at the confirmation on the screen. IRS-CI-2001-NY-847, 847 files. 14 months of work collapsed into a single case number that would end my son's career and might be the only thing standing between him and a body bag. The house held its silence. Nadia asleep above me, the Naperville street dark outside, while somewhere inside the IRS Criminal Investigation Division's overnight queue, an automated system was routing my whistleblower package toward AUSA Ingrid Bascom's desk. I sat in that blue glow and let the word irreversible settle in my chest. In 8 hours, the roof would come down on my son's office. In 9, Celeste would know I'd called her bluff. And somewhere in Chicago, Rowan Maddox would learn that the retired IRS agent he'd been framing for 14 months had just transmitted 847 files to criminal investigation. What none of them knew, I had one card left before the clock ran out. I picked up the phone and texted Clifton. Form 3949-A submitted. Case number IRS-CI-2001-NY-847. Timestamp 2:17 a.m. Activate warrant package. The reply landed 30 seconds later. Bascom notified. Warrant app goes to judge at 6 a.m. You just started a war. I set the phone down and closed the laptop. Yes, a war I intended to finish. Friday morning, 7:45 a.m. I sat across from Nadia, eating toast and maintaining the pretense that the world wasn't going to come apart in 73 minutes. After I'd walked her through the full blueprint at 2 o'clock in the morning, she'd taken the den couch rather than go back upstairs. Now she was working through black coffee and watching me with ruse exactness, reading quiet the way a surgeon reads a monitor. "You uploaded everything," she said, not a question. 2:17 this morning. Case number IRS-CI-2001-NY-847. She nodded once. Clifton activated the warrant package. Should have. We'll know when my phone moves. It moved. Clifton Ward. I put him on speaker. Warrant signed at 6:30. He said. No preamble, his voice carrying the flatness of someone who'd been awake past the point protocol allowed. Judge Lorena Fitch, Southern District. FBI tactical sweep scheduled for 1000 hours. 4 teams, Sentinel Tower, 14 Elmwood Drive, Joliet Port Facility, and Maddox's River North residence. Nadia set her coffee down without a sound. The wire, I said. Dead. Clifton's exhale carried the specific weight of satisfaction. Treasury froze all 14 endpoint accounts at 6:45. Your son's routing instructions ran straight into a wall. $180 million is sitting in regulatory suspension with your case number across the top. The entry twist had landed clean, $180 million severed before Celeste was out of bed. 2 years of financial architecture dismantled in a single freeze order. Nolan, I said, still in the building. B3 parking level. His Tesla hasn't moved since Wednesday night. Clifton paused. Garrett, we have a complication. Of course we did. Maddox's cleaners are inside the elevator security perimeter. Thermal imaging picked them up at midnight. They've been holding in the northwest stairwell for 7 hours. My hand tightened on the phone. Nolan doesn't know. No reason he would. They're 3 floors below him waiting on the wire transfer window. Clifton's voice dropped a register. Maddox doesn't know the wire is dead. Neither do the cleaners. They're running on the original timeline. 10:30 move, 11 o'clock execution, noon confirmation, departure window after that. Nadia's face had gone completely still. Which means, I said slowly, they're going to move on my son in approximately 82 minutes. Maybe less, Clifton finished. If Maddox gets a signal something's wrong. The arithmetic was merciless. FBI sweep at 10 a.m. Cleaners operating on a pre-freeze timeline expecting wire confirmation at 11. Nolan trapped between 2 converging clocks with no awareness of either. Can you warn him? Nadia asked Clifton directly. Not without flagging Maddox. Nolan's phone is compromised. Your father confirmed Maddox was listening Thursday night. Any contact tips, our position. I stood up. The chair scraped hard across the kitchen tile. Garrett. Clifton's voice tightened. The AUSA was explicit. This is a federal operation. You stay clear until the building perimeter is locked. Silence. External only, Clifton added. FBI can't secure interior access before sweep initiation. It's a public commercial building with 1,400 daily occupants. Moving early triggers Maddox's contingencies, which meant Maddox's cleaners had 73 minutes of uncontested movement inside an unsecured building while my son sat 1 floor above them, believing his father had a plan that covered him. What do you do when the person you're trying to protect has no idea they're about to be killed? I grabbed my keys off the counter. I'm going in. Dad, no, Nadia started. You stay here. No softness in it. The same register I'd used when she was 16 and wanted the car in a blizzard. If Clifton calls with updates, you're my relay. Understood. 3 seconds. Then she nodded. Clifton was still on the line. Garrett, if you enter that building before the FBI sweep, you compromise the entire operation. Judge Fitch was unambiguous. Your teams are 73 minutes out, I said, moving toward the garage. Maddox's people are already inside. The math doesn't hold, Clifton. I ended the call. The Buick turned over clean. 7:52 a.m. I-78 eastbound to the city would put me in the loop by 8:40 if the flow cooperated. FBI sweep at 10 meant tactical staging around 9:30. Perimeter lock at 9:45. That gave me roughly 15 minutes to get Nolan out before federal authority turned Sentinel Tower into a sealed site, assuming Maddox's cleaners didn't accelerate. I merged onto the interstate. Morning commuter traffic moved in its ordinary rhythm toward the city, carrying none of the weight of what was about to land across 4 simultaneous raid locations. My phone rang at 8:30, Judge Greer. Judge Fitch just reached me. He said no greeting. Clifton notified her. You're heading to the breach site. I'm extracting my son before your federal colleagues arrive. Garrett, hear me? The courtroom register, clean, uncompromising. If you enter that building before FBI initiation, you create blue-on-blue risk. Tactical won't know your face. You'll be an unidentified civilian inside an active warrant zone. Best case, they detain you. Worst case, Maddox's cleaners have a 73-minute head start. I cut in. They're already inside the perimeter. Nolan doesn't know. Your teams can't breach early without collapsing the operation. Tell me what choice that leaves. Silence on the line, then Greer exhaled. Alma, I'm connecting you to the tactical feed, he said it finally. Frequency Theta 7, real-time FBI staging updates live on that channel. And if I'm saying if you go in ahead of schedule, you announce your position immediately. Clear, no silent movement through that building. Clear. And Garrett. Greer's voice went quiet. None of this happened. I hold a federal judgeship. Civilian interference in an active FBI operation is not something I sanctioned. The line went dead. My phone lit up 2 seconds later with an encrypted channel link. The needle climbed past 75, then 80. 6 minutes to the Lincoln Tunnel. Greer's tactical patch hissed through the speaker staging teams calling in their locations. Perimeter checks warrant confirmation. The AUSA's position had been unambiguous. Go in before the sweep and any friendly fire incident lands on me. I pushed it past 85. At 9:15 a.m., while I was still threading the tunnel, Nadia was at the kitchen table in our Naperville house composing the first message she'd sent her brother in 24 months. I had no idea. I wouldn't learn what she'd done until that night when she walked me through it. Voice controlled, but her eyes gave her away. The sequence is what matters, though, because while I was running hot with Greer's staging updates crackling through the speaker, my daughter was staring at her laptop as a Wells Fargo automated notice filled the screen. Account freeze notice, federal order. Account holder Rue Hale. Freeze timestamp, September 20th, 2001 Eastern Standard Time. Authority IRS-CI case, number 2001-NY-0847. Nadia captured the screen, then forwarded it to Nolan's cell, the number she hadn't touched since July 1999, the month he went silent on her calls about settling their mother's estate. She wrote 11 words beneath the image. Nolan, Mom, has been in the ground for 5 years. Look at what you've done to her name. Send at 9:33 a.m. She put the phone on the counter and came apart. Not rage, she said when she described it to me. Just grief. Grief for Rue. For the Nolan who rang their mother every Sunday at 7 p.m., never missed it. For the family that preceded $200 million in offshore architecture before all of it reshaped her brother into a man who ran fraud proceeds through a dead woman's name. 2 years of silence, and what broke it was a bank notice proving their mother's identity had been hollowed out and used. I cleared the Lincoln Tunnel at 9:22 a.m. The Buick's GPS threaded me through surface streets in the direction of the Sentinel Tower, while FBI Tactical Frequency Theta 7 called in updated positions every 90 seconds. Alpha and Bravo teams pushing out from the Dirksen Federal Building. Charlie inbound from Joliet. Delta staged at the Hudson Crossing waiting on green light. I pulled into a metered spot 1 block west at 9:34 a.m., 6 minutes on the meter. Irrelevant. 6 minutes was more than I'd need. 48 seconds to reach the Sentinel Tower's west entrance. Street-level foot traffic ran moderate commuters with briefcases, people juggling coffee, none of them registering that federal warrants were closing in on this address with surgical coordination. Reed Fenner was posted near the revolving doors. I'd never been in the same room as him before, but the profile was unmistakable slight frame, the kind of face that dissolves into a crowd, the specific brand of physical inconspicuousness that investigative reporters work to maintain. His bag sat across one shoulder, the concealed lens angled at the entrance capture running. If things unraveled, Reed's footage would anchor the case record. He gave me the smallest possible nod. Confirmation in position recording. I didn't return. It just kept moving across the marble toward the lobby interior. 9:39 a.m. My phone buzzed. Clifton Ward. 7 words in the text. Tactical, 22 minutes. Out. Do not board before 9:55. 22 minutes. A 10 a.m. sweep meant the perimeter would be locked and teams would breach simultaneously at 10 sharp, staging done by 9:55. Clifton's instruction was explicit: hold ground level until federal units had the building. That was the protocol. 30 years, and I'd never broken it. I ran my eyes across the security desk in the lobby. Kara Odom was gone shift rotation. A young guard had the post attention fixed on his phone, not the door. Behind him, a bank of 6 monitors fed building camera views. Lobby, elevator banks, parking decks. B1 through B3, loading dock. Penthouse corridor. 47th floor. That last monitor was black, not a blue no-signal card, not rolling static. Just black. Solid total black, the specific absence that means someone has physically cut the fiber. My heart rate held. 3 decades in this business trains you to convert the adrenaline surge into sharper attention. Someone had severed the optical line feeding the 47th floor camera. Maddox's cleaners. 24 months of silence. 1 frozen account. 1 forwarded screenshot. That's the entire chain that converted a daughter's grief into actionable evidence. 9:41 a.m. on my watch. Clifton's order hold 14 minutes for the tactical sweep, but the dead camera said Nolan might have 7 before Maddox's team completed whatever they'd come up to finish. This is standard procedure when you're conducting a termination inside a building that's about to be hit. You take out the eyes first. Kill the cameras. Work quickly. Be gone before the federal door opens. The math was punishing. They'd been in position since midnight, a 7-hour head start. They'd held through the night, waiting on the wire transfer window, confident that confirmation would arrive at 11 a.m. It wouldn't, because Treasury had moved on the accounts at 6:45. They had no way of knowing that. Maddox had no way of knowing that. They were working from pre-freeze intelligence, which meant when 1100 came and the wire sat frozen, Nolan's status would flip from asset to liability in roughly 6 seconds. The camera was already gone. My phone went off again. Clifton. Blue on blue risk active. Hold your position. I typed back, 47th floor feed is dead. Optical's been cut. 3 dots immediate. Then FBI tactical carrying thermal. All heat signatures will be mapped on entry. Do not go in early. Thermal would sort it out, distinguish the bodies, locate the threat, pull Nolan out clean. If the cleaners sat still for 14 more minutes. If they didn't move the instant they understood the wire had gone nowhere. If my son was still breathing in the window between a severed camera cable and a federal breach. I took in the elevator bank. Took in Reed Fenner at his position by the doors lens still running. Took in that monitor, the flat black rectangle where floor 47 used to be. Dead screen cut fiber. 14 minutes Clifton's protocol. Judge Fitch's warrant stand down, let federal tactical take the floor. 30 years of IRS work, honor the system. Hold the line, don't poison the operation. But the black screen told me my son was on a darkened floor with 2 contractors who'd traveled from Frankfurt to erase a loose end ahead of a wire that was never going to clear. And whatever I was as an agent, I was his father first. Clifton's message said 14 minutes. The monitor said Nolan had maybe 7. I moved past Reed's nod and walked toward the elevator bank. The cab was rising toward 47 when I dropped Clifton's call. He was mid-sentence, fall back the team, and then just the low mechanical drone of the lift. I'd keyed the residential elevator with the clone fob. The guard never raised his eyes from his screen. This bank ran exclusively to the penthouse tier floors 45 through 48, biometric or authorized card required. My clone fob authenticated as Nolan Hale CFO, authorized resident. The numbers ticked up through the display, 32, 35, 38. Clifton had called twice while I was crossing the lobby. I picked up on the 3rd ring, still in motion toward the elevator. I'm heading up, I said. Floor 47 is dark. His response was clipped. Garrett Tactical is 17 minutes out. You step onto that floor right now, every consequence is yours. Fall back. I ended it. 41, 43, 45. The car decelerated. The counter settled on 47. 1 chime, clean, bright, almost cheerful against everything waiting past those doors. They opened onto silence. 30 feet of corridor in both directions. Low-pile carpet and dove-gray recessed fixtures spaced every 8 feet, throwing shallow rings of light. Penthouse entries at each end, east and west, solid wood doors with brass hardware. No sign of forced entry. No bodies. Nothing audible. Just a quiet, dense enough to press against you. I stepped off. Behind me, the doors drew shut, sealing the connection to ground level to Clifton's feed, to the accumulated logic of 30 years that said, hold and let the trained teams handle it. The air told a different story. Not the antiseptic edge of cleaning product, not the synthetic warmth of a candle, not the dead neutrality of climate-controlled air. Tobacco. European tobacco, specifically fuller and slightly sweet in a way domestic brands never are. The kind that soaks into clothing and hair when someone smokes where they shouldn't. Dunhill. I knew the scent because Rue's father had burned through Dunhill Gold every Sunday night in his study for 40 years straight. Old world expensive. The brand you pick up airside at Frankfurt International, not off a shelf in Chicago. Nobody sitting at a desk in this building smoked Dunhill. That aroma meant someone was on this floor who had no business being here. Cleaners, near. The smell alone confirmed they'd moved through building security and were operating somewhere down this hall. I tried both penthouse doors. The west suite was locked dark at the threshold. East suite door resting against the frame without catching. Maybe half an inch of gap enough for interior light to bleed out into the hallway. I eased it open. No sound. Commercial hinges well maintained. The penthouse living room spread out in front of me. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking Chicago's midtown grid furniture placed with the kind of precision that costs money to achieve. Everything in cream and chrome, the emptiness deliberate. Celeste Dre stood with her back to the door at the far edge of the glass perimeter. No guards at her sides. No Saren Thorne nearby working a phone. None of the boardroom composure. None of the armored corporate affect. Just a woman alone in an expensive room, utterly still facing 50 floors of open air. Dunhill tobacco in a corridor like this, like finding a Paris couturier in a truck stop. Someone out of place was very near. She didn't turn when I crossed the threshold. The door, my footsteps on the hardwood, none of it registered. "They're in Nolan's study," she said barely above a breath. End of the hall. Maddox ordered a full ledger closing. I stopped 6 feet behind her. Her shoulders were shaking, a real visible tremor beneath a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly note. Her face in the glass reflection was bloodless, eyes too wide, her breathing fast and shallow. This was not the woman who had spent 2 years constructing a forgery operation. Not the calculated operator who wore Rue's watch like a trophy. Not the person who had assembled a laundering infrastructure with surgical care. This was terror. "I didn't authorize blood," she whispered. The sentence ended abruptly as if she'd bitten the rest back. I moved a step closer. "Which suite?" She pointed east without facing me. Her hand trembled. "How many two? They arrived Wednesday. Frankfurt routing." Her voice had gone flat, the flatness of shock. "Maddox's contingency. I believed they were just leverage insurance if the wire transfer fell through." "The wire did fall through," I said. "Treasury locked the accounts at 6:45 this morning." Her reflection flinched. "Maddox doesn't know that. The cleaners don't know that." "No." She turned at last. Pale face, dilated pupils, still breathing wrong. 2 years of composure had come apart entirely. They were working from the original schedule, 1100 confirmation noon departure, which meant they'd been sitting in Nolan's study for 90 minutes, waiting on a wire that was never going to move. And when 1100 arrived without confirmation, they'd move to the secondary protocol, eliminate the liability. "Where's Saren?" I asked. "Gone. Left around 7 this morning. Said she had a family situation in Minneapolis." Celeste's laugh had no warmth in it. I believed her. Believed her right up until the cleaners came through and told me Maddox had sent direct orders. Then the picture clarified. Saren hadn't been there to protect Celeste. She'd been Maddox's monitoring asset planted to watch her, the same function Clifton had outlined when he briefed me on Saren's fabricated background. And now Celeste was standing here alone in a penthouse while 2 Frankfurt contractors waited down the hall to settle Maddox's accounts. 3 decades of tracking fraudsters gives you a feel for the moment a perpetrator understands they've become the target. Celeste had just crossed that line. "Guards?" I asked. "Building security pulled them at 8, described it as a routine rotation change." Her voice gave slightly. Routine like nothing about this had been arranged. No guards, no Saren, camera feed already dead. FBI still 12 minutes from a tactical breach. Celeste had been isolated with professional efficiency. "Your son is in there with them," she said. "Maddox told them to hold for wire confirmation. When it doesn't arrive, and it won't, they'll clear the exposure and go out through the service stairwell before your federal people hit the floor." She was handing me information, steering me toward my son. The woman who had forged my signature framed me, defiled Rue's name, now standing pale and discarded, pointing me toward Nolan with a shaking hand because Maddox had reclassified her from architect to loose end. The Dunhill scent intensified toward the east corridor. 30 feet down that hall, maybe less. Close enough that careless footsteps would carry. I had maybe 90 seconds before they decided the ledger needed closing. I turned the brass handle and walked into the study. My son was seated between 2 men in black wool coats. The tobacco smell wasn't a trace anymore. It was everywhere. I'd come down the east corridor, deliberately measured pace, nothing aggressive. The handle moved smoothly. Inside, Nolan sat rigid, his face drained of color. 2 men, black wool European cut, shoulder holsters showing, Dunhill smoke thick in the air. The lead salt and pepper crew, cut somewhere in his 40s, held an encrypted burner and was signaling for Nolan to get up. Both of them swung toward me when I entered. I kept my hands open and visible. I addressed them in fluent German. No accent. The FBI was 20 minutes out, and they already had eyes on our position inside the building. The lead man's posture shifted. A recalculation. I switched to English. Take the freight elevator in 60 seconds or spend the afternoon explaining yourselves to a federal magistrate over my son's head. 3 seconds. No weapons came out. Nolan was unharmed but rigid with fear. The service corridor door stood slightly ajar behind them. The lead man's burner buzzed. He listened. One nod. Both men crossed to the rear corridor without a word. 2 Frankfurt professionals doing institutional arithmetic. Whatever Maddox was paying, it didn't pencil out against federal custody, with active warrants and tactical units building at every entrance point below. The rear door closed behind them. Measured steps down the service stairwell. Not running. Gone. 60 seconds. Fluent German. No shots fired. That's how you clear a room when the math does it for you. I looked at my son. Nolan's hands had the armrests in a white-knuckled grip, face still drained, breathing thin. His eyes found me and held there not with the fear he'd had of the men who just left. This was a different fear. You okay? He nodded. I moved to the windows. FBI tactical vehicles, 2 blocks south, staged at the perimeter. Unmarked sedans had the cross streets locked. 90 seconds from a hard breach. They didn't touch you. No, voice thin. They just held position. Said Maddox told them to sit tight until the wire moved. When I asked what would happen if it didn't, they didn't answer. The answer hadn't required words. Clear the exposure. Standard ledger protocol. Nolan released the armrests. The Wall Street finish he'd been wearing since he was 18 had cracked through. What was left looked like my son at 32, the way he'd looked at 16. FBI is 3 minutes out, I said. When they breach full cooperation, material witness disclosure. Everything I know. He moved to the sofa, palms flat on his knees. Confessional posture. It was my play, Dad. Fast rehearsed. I suggested using your name. You were retired out of circulation. I assumed you'd never surface. The Garrett Hale chairman, documentation, forged signatures, all of it. Celeste built the architecture, but the concept was mine. I pitched it. In your mother's account, I said. He closed his eyes. That was Celeste. I told her we could run the secondary tier through a dormant SSN, gave her the number from the estate paperwork. I didn't know she'd take Mom's full identity until the account was already open. He looked up. I know that doesn't change anything. No, I said. It doesn't. Nolan had conceived the scheme to use me, counted on his retired father being too far removed to notice. I didn't know Maddox would send contractors when the account's locked, he went on. Didn't know about Frankfurt Assets contingency protocols, any of it. He stopped, let out a breath. I was an idiot. The truth unadorned. The rarest thing after 48 hours inside Maddox's machine. FBI sirens closer now, tactical units dismounting, stacking at entry points. I took the sofa across from him, the same one from 2 Thanksgivings ago when Nadia was still in the room with him and Rue had been gone a year instead of 5. Why? I asked. Money. Clean and brutal. Maddox had offered the CFO title and equity if Nolan could solve the domestic exposure problem. Celeste needed a compliant spouse with credible Wall Street credentials, someone who wouldn't ask the wrong questions. I saw the angle: use your IRS background as a credibility layer, put you on paper as chairman, run everything through structures you'd never reach. And when I found the files, he panicked. Wednesday night when I called about Geneva, he knew I'd been on his trail. He'd gone to Maddox, who said he'd manage it. Nolan assumed that meant attorneys, maybe a negotiated settlement. He didn't know it meant he gestured toward the rear corridor. 48 hours inside Maddox's machine, and my son had finally offered the 3 words every father of a prodigal waits to hear. I was an idiot. The study windows shuttered. Heavy boots in the main corridor. Federal tactical breach, synchronized entry radio traffic equipment harnesses snapping. Hard breach 3 minutes out. Full material witness disclosure the moment they're through the door, I said. Already done, he said, steadier now. Clifton reached me Thursday night through an encrypted line. Offered material witness protection for testimony against Maddox and Celeste. I accepted. I looked at him. You think I wanted to die in that study? The moment those cleaners walked through on Wednesday, I understood Maddox had moved me from asset to liability. Clifton's offer was the only way out that didn't end in Frankfurt or a federal cell. Clifton had been running parallel tracks, briefing me while simultaneously flipping my son. FBI sirens rose from street level, maybe 90 seconds from breach. Nolan had just given me the unvarnished truth. He'd set me up certain I'd never surface it. The question wasn't whether he'd cooperate. It was whether cooperation would pull him clear of the ledger Maddox was still closing. Below, federal agents were stacking at every entry point. And somewhere in this building, Rowan Maddox was calculating whether to run or remove the last witness who could put him at the center of it. The FBI hit the foyer door hard, and Celeste turned to face me with her phone screen raised one final card before the federal flood hit. The sirens had gone silent, replaced by the rhythmic percussion of a tactical breach. Steel ram against a commercial-grade door synchronized impacts every 3 seconds. The penthouse glass shuddered with each strike. Nolan stayed on the study sofa. Celeste had moved from wherever she'd been standing, crossing the living room toward me, phone extended like she was tendering Exhibit A. Security loop showing you entering without authorization. You take a felony obstruction charge before they clear the room. Her voice had recovered its clinical edge. Last card. Terminal leverage before federal custody stripped away her operational capacity. I reached for my reading glasses with the same deliberate cadence I'd used before delivering final audit conclusions, folded them, slid them into my breast pocket, right hand drawing a folded printout from my jacket in the same motion. Criminal Investigation Portal Confirmation, 1-page timestamped. I unfolded it at reading distance and held it steady. Case IRS-CI-2001-NY-847. Timestamp 2:17 a.m., September 20th. Her eyes went to that timestamp. Pupils widened. Ardwell Fund 3 blocked at 6:45 this morning. Your wire is dead. The FBI isn't here for my entry. They're here for you. The math was absolute. She'd delivered her Thursday ultimatum at 3:45 p.m. I'd filed the whistleblower package at 2:17 a.m. Friday, 7 hours before her window expired, 7 hours before she'd expected me to fold. Celeste's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The foyer door gave with a crack of splintering wood. FBI tactical flooded through in synchronized entry weapons, up voice commands overlapping and layering over each other. Federal agents, hands visible, do not move. I raised both hands slowly. Confirmation page still in my right. Celeste raised hers. Phone screen dark. Final threat extinguished by a timestamp she had no answer for. 7 hours. The margin between her ultimatum and my 2:17 a.m. submission. The distance between her power play and my preemptive move. 6 tactical agents swept through the penthouse clearing room, securing corners, checking the rear service corridor. Behind them, a woman in her mid-40s entered with the bearing that courtroom prosecutors develop over a decade of litigation. Navy suit, minimal jewelry eyes that process detail the way auditors process discrepancies. Ingrid Bascom, Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. 46 years old, lean in a way that suggested distance running. I knew her face from the contact Judge Greer had passed to me, the AUSA who had signed off on Clifton's warrant package. She went straight to Celeste. Celeste Dre, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Bascom's delivery had the measured cadence of someone who'd read Miranda 1,000 times. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Celeste offered no resistance. She stood with hands raised while a tactical agent moved in with restraints. The composure she'd maintained for 2 years had dissolved entirely. What remained was a person who'd staked institutional weight against enforcement precision and lost by a 7-hour margin. Clifton Ward appeared at my shoulder. I hadn't heard him come in. His hand found my arm and steered me toward the kitchen alcove away from the tactical sweep. Lower your hands, he said quietly. You're not under arrest. I dropped them. Watch them secure Nolan professional courtesy material, witness, not defendant. Bascom has Celeste's processing. How long, I asked. He understood what I meant. 6 months. I turned to look at him directly. We've had counter surveillance on you for 6 months. Clifton continued, barely audible beneath the radio traffic of the tactical team. The moment our wiretap caught Maddox registering your name in March, we knew you were a kinetic shield, not just an administrative fall guy. Had to keep you in the dark so your pattern stayed normal and Maddox wouldn't feel the shift. Kinetic shield. Enforcement terminology for an asset positioned to draw retaliation while investigators build the case behind institutional cover. You knew in March, I said slowly. Before I found the Case Watch directory, before I cloned the fob, before I knew Nolan was involved. We knew Maddox was positioning you. You didn't know for what until your surveillance files began to accumulate. Clifton's hand stayed on my shoulder. Could have told you. Probably should have. But the moment you knew you were being framed, your behavior would have changed. Maddox would have seen it. He'd have pivoted to a different fall guy, maybe someone without your investigative reach. 6 months running dark, while Clifton's team watched from institutional shadow. I'd believed I was working alone and that solitude had kept me precise enough to get here. So you let me run the investigation, I said, knowing Maddox might send cleaners, knowing my son was complicit. We needed what you were building. Clifton's voice carried no apology, only operational fact. Your Case Watch directory gave us chronology that wiretaps alone couldn't establish. Your timeline proved premeditation. Your documentation of Rue's fraudulent account proved intent to harm. You were constructing our case while thinking you were building yours. 20 feet away, FBI agents were photographing the penthouse, cataloging evidence, preparing Celeste and Nolan for transport to federal processing. And I had been institutional armor the entire time without knowing it. Clifton's hand stayed on my shoulder in the kitchen alcove while the agents worked. You weren't running this alone, he said, the warmest piece of irony I'd heard in 30 years. The institutional cover had been there the whole time, invisible by design, which meant someone above Clifton had authorized 6 months of surveillance and decided I was worth protecting before I'd known I needed it. The AUSA gave me 2 minutes with my son before they loaded him into the elevator. Nolan, a few inches taller, the same height difference I'd first registered when he turned 16. Clifton's disclosure about institutional armor was still landing when Ingrid Bascom came to me in the kitchen alcove. Material witness gets 2 minutes before transport, she said, if you want it. I nodded. Now Nolan stood in the elevator lobby with 2 federal agents beside him, wrists unsecured per Bascom's accommodation. The sterile corridor stretched between us. Dove gray carpet, recessed lighting, the neutral architecture of high-end commercial space. I walked toward him and stopped 3 feet away. He looked different from 90 minutes ago in the study. The Wall Street finish was entirely gone. What was left was my son at 32, with Rue's eyes and my jaw, his posture carrying the weight of someone who'd aged a decade in 48 hours. I'd first clocked the height differential the summer he turned 16. We'd been loading camping gear when I noticed he was looking down at me slightly. A strange surge of pride cut through with loss. My son outgrowing me the way sons are supposed to. The same differential held now. Him looking down, me looking up. I spent 32 years unable to say I love you without attaching a lesson, I said. The confession landed between us like evidence entered without preamble. Nolan's expression didn't move, but something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition maybe, or acknowledgement that the pattern I'd named was accurate. Every exchange since you were 12, I went on. Birthday calls, Thanksgiving dinners the night you got into Wharton. I'd say the words and pivot straight to advice. Strategic framework as if affection needed an operational addendum. 32 years of binding lessons to love. 32 years of audit precision where warmth should have been. And here, in a sterile corridor, the only form I could find for it was plea exposure calculus. But if I hadn't filed Form 3949-A at dawn, Maddox's contractors would have cleared this floor before the market opened. I kept my voice level. Federal detention is the only place on this island where I can guarantee your pulse stays active. You agreed to cooperate. Your exposure will be a fraction of the maximum. Nolan stood quiet. The agents flanking him held professional distance, monitoring every word. Ingrid Bascom is the best AUSA in the Southern District, I said. She wouldn't have offered material witness protection if the case against you were airtight. They need your testimony more than your conviction. Still attaching lessons. Still unable to state the plain biological fact without folding it inside legal strategy. But maybe that was the only vocabulary I possessed. Maybe 30 years in enforcement had hardened my language to the point where love could only travel through protection calculus and institutional positioning. Your mother would have handled this better, I said quietly. That landed differently. Nolan's jaw tightened. His gaze shifted past my shoulder to some point I couldn't see. Rue would have known how to say it without the scaffolding. She'd have stood here in this corridor and given him affection directly. No institutional framework required. But Rue had been gone 5 years, and I was the one standing here working from the only vocabulary I'd ever built: evidence strategy protection protocol. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I said. I'm not asking for reconciliation. I'm telling you that when Maddox's cleaners were burning Dunhill in that study, the only calculation that mattered was getting you out before they understood the wire had gone nowhere. Nolan's eyes returned to mine. The forgery the frame built around my name. I stopped, let it out slowly. We'll process that later. Right now, you're upright and breathing, and that's the only metric I'm tracking. One of the agents shifted. The window was closing. Federal detention runs 16 weeks minimum before a plea hearing, I continued. Clifton will handle witness protection logistics. Nadia, I paused. Nadia sent you a message this morning about your mother's account. She'll need time before she's ready to speak. But the line isn't cut, it's damaged. Same as the line between Nolan and me. Not severed. Damaged. Requiring reconstruction that would take longer than 16 weeks and draw on emotional reserves neither of us currently held. Your attorney will be in contact within 24 hours. Material witness cooperation means dedicated counsel. Answer every question they put to you, nothing withheld. Maddox's ledger closing directive stays active until they have him located. Strategic framework. Operational guidance. Love expressed through protection arithmetic because that was the only language I carried. The agent on Nolan's left touched his arm gently. Time, Mr. Hale. Nolan nodded, started toward the elevator, then stopped. He didn't turn his head, didn't look back. Just stood at the threshold of the elevator cab with his shoulders squared and said one word barely above a breath. Dad. Not absolution. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Not the healing vocabulary that a family therapist would probably prescribe for a father and son who'd just come through 48 hours inside a financial apparatus designed to sever biological bonds. Just acknowledgement. One syllable. Dad. Not absolution proof that the biological line could survive what the machine had tried to erase. The agents walked him into the elevator, the door shut with the hydraulic whisper of commercial-grade mechanics. And I stood alone in the corridor with my hand still raised in some unfinished gesture, reaching towards something or waving off something or just frozen because I didn't know what else to do with it. The doors had sealed. I lowered my hand. That would have to be sufficient. It would carry me through what came next, the federal process, the media storm, the reassembly of a family that had nearly come apart over money neither of us would ever touch. I walked out onto the Sentinel Tower Plaza at 11:30 a.m. and September air hit like a hard reset. Media scrum 20 feet out. Reed Fenner was waiting near the perimeter with his recorder off. Federal processing had consumed 90 minutes. A USA BASCOM had walked me through material witness protocols, sworn statement verification, timeline confirmation. Clifton had stayed in the room throughout, silent and institutional presence, ensuring nothing slipped. Now I stood in September sunlight with news crews pressed against the FBI's perimeter barriers. Cameras up, reporters calling questions I couldn't separate from each other. Reed moved toward me with the practiced casualness of a journalist who understood how to navigate attention, not hurrying, not retreating, just using the specific invisibility the work teaches you. I captured the full entry sequence when Tactical went in, he said quietly, positioning himself so his back cut the nearest camera's sightline. Complete breach footage, Celeste's arrest, the material witness escort, everything Clifton briefed me to document. I nodded. Run the corporate asset tracing, keep my son's face off the front page. Reed studied me for 3 seconds. Something settled behind his eyes. He'd already angled the story toward Ardwell Capital's institutional collapse, Maddox's offshore architecture, Celeste's contractual marriage scheme, Barry Nolan. 3 paragraphs deep as cooperating CFO, rather than leading with my son's face attached to fraud charges. A small mercy, but mercy nonetheless. That evening, the Financial Times went live with Reed's piece, Ardwell Capital CFO arrested in $180 million scheme, retired IRS agent's tip breaks case. I read the headline in my Naperville office. 3rd floor room window overlooking the backyard where Rue used to garden before the cancer spread. Retired IRS agent's tip breaks case. Not father exposes son's fraud, not family fractured by money laundering. Just institutional framing that kept my identity as a parent out of the digital record. A strange, clean relief I couldn't quite name, as if something worth protecting had been preserved by chance rather than intention. The piece ran the full corporate architecture, Ardwell's 2-year scheme, Maddox's Frankfurt connections, Celeste's fabricated compliance documentation. Nolan appeared in paragraph 8 as the CFO cooperating with federal investigators. No photograph, no biographical detail, just a title and a cooperation status. Reed had grasped what I'd asked for without needing it spelled out. Friday afternoon at 2 p.m., I signed final material witness verifications at the Dirksen Federal Building. Clifton sat across the conference table while AUSA Bascom reviewed my timeline documentation. She closed the folder and set a sealed evidence bag on the table. Inside, PC Philippe stainless steel case, black leather band face catching the fluorescent ceiling light. "Engraving matches your property registration," Bascom said. "Cleared for release." I slid the watch free from the plastic bag and turned it over. Engraving still sharp after 30 years. FQ always. Rue had purchased it in 1971, our 10th anniversary. I remembered the weight of the box in my hands that Sunday morning, heavier than it looked, the way things that matter always are. I'd worn it every day for 18 years until the April morning in 1996 when hospice called and I'd left it on the nightstand. Never put it back on. Every glance at my wrist would have meant calculating minutes she was no longer accumulating. Celeste had displayed it in the penthouse like casual decoration, a trophy from a framing operation that had weaponized my dead wife's identity for laundering infrastructure. Now it sat in my palm, metal cool against skin, secondhand, moving without hesitation. The PC Felipe had spent 48 hours in an evidence bag while my son sat in Maddox's crosshairs. Now both had been returned, one ticking cleanly, one breathing unevenly, both mine again. I buckled the leather band around my left wrist. 2:17 p.m. Same timestamp I'd filed the whistleblower package 40 hours earlier. Time returned. Not absolution, just mechanical continuity evidence that some things outlast the institutional machinery designed to grind them into exhibits. Friday evening at 7:30 p.m. I came home to Naperville. Nadia had made pot roast, the exact recipe Rue had prepared every Friday before the diagnosis made red meat something to avoid. We ate in near total silence at the kitchen table where Nolan used to sit before Wall Street turned him into someone who'd treat his father's retirement as an instrument for equity points. Nadia ladled a second portion onto my plate. I finished it completely, not from hunger but from refusing to let my daughter watch food go uneaten after she'd spent 3 hours preparing Rue's ritual. She set her fork down. "Do you regret dropping the file?" I sat with the question. Watched the PC Felipe's second hand sweep past 12. "Regret the drop, no." I held her gaze. Same directness Rue had used whenever she asked something that required an honest answer rather than a managed one. "Regret that my life required it every morning for whatever years I have left. Yes." Nadia nodded slowly. "Mom would be proud." "Would she?" "Not because you brought down Ardwell," she said quietly. "Because you kept Nolan alive to face it," reframing Rue's hypothetical pride from destruction to preservation. Not the institutional collapse, but the biological line held against cleaners and Frankfurt protocols that existed specifically to close ledgers for good. Pot roast on a Friday night. Rue's ritual passed into Nadia's hands, not absolution continuity in the form of braised meat and silence. After dinner, I stood at the kitchen window and watched the apple tree in the backyard bare branches against September dusk. The same tree Nolan had climbed at age 7 before Wall Street and offshore architecture and contractual marriage arrangements. I wanted to live long enough to see him sit under its shade again. Federal sentence served biological line intact, despite everything the machine had tried to cut. The resolution wouldn't arrive in days or weeks. It would spread across months of depositions, plea negotiations, and the slow work of rebuilding a family that had endured laundered damage no one would ever touch. 6 weeks after the elevator doors closed on Nolan, I was in my Naperville armchair when CNBC announced that Rowan Maddox had been detained at Frankfurt Airport. The resolution I'd said wouldn't come in days had arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October. 6 weeks of depositions. 6 weeks of plea negotiations. 6 weeks watching the apple tree shed whatever leaves September had left behind. CNBC ran a breaking banner. Rowan Maddox, 52, detained at Frankfurt Airport on international red notice issued by the DOJ and Interpol regarding Ardwell Capital indictments. Extradition to New York underway. Clifton had texted an hour before. I'd been in the kitchen making coffee when my phone moved. Saren had entered witness protection, turned over European encryption keys. Maddox's landing window was shut. Saren Thorne, the fabricated identity Clifton had walked me through. Interpol red notice out of Seoul for financial crimes. Maddox's monitoring asset planted to watch Celeste, who had believed Saren was her security. Now she'd flipped, entered federal witness protection, and surrendered Maddox's European encryption architecture. The offshore keys that would open routing protocols, shell company documentation beneficiary structures spread across 14 jurisdictions. The institutional machinery had performed exactly as it was built, to slow, methodical grinding forward with bureaucratic patience that felt glacial from the inside, but looked efficient in hindsight. I switched off the television and sat in complete quiet while October afternoon light cut through the living room at a low angle. Clean, heavy feeling of a ledger finally shut and shelved. 6 weeks out. Maddox detained. Seren protected. Funds frozen. Nolan cooperating. The machine taken apart one arrest at a time. Celeste had been processed 6 weeks earlier. Material witness reclassified to defendant when her cooperation proved less valuable than Nolan's institutional knowledge. Remanded to the Metropolitan Correctional Center pending trial. No bail flight risk with documented offshore resources. Clifton's wiretaps had established it clearly. Nolan remained at the Metropolitan Correctional Center under material witness protocols. 16 weeks minimum before a plea hearing. Cooperation agreement in place. Testimony against Maddox and Celeste in exchange for reduced exposure. I hadn't visited, hadn't called. The federal system discourages family contact during active cooperation windows contamination risk. The possibility that defendants might apply emotional pressure to cooperating witnesses. So I waited. Watched October strip the apple tree bare. Followed the Financial Times coverage of Ardwell's institutional unraveling. Read Reed Fenner's follow-up pieces tracking offshore asset seizures. Wondered whether the biological line I'd worked to preserve would hold through 16 weeks of federal detention and whatever reconstruction came after. Early November arrived with cold mornings and the first hard frost. Monday morning I walked the gravel path to the mailbox at the road. 30-year routine coffee, first, then mail, then administrative work in the third-floor office overlooking Rue's garden. Inside the mailbox, a single white legal envelope. Return address in purple ink. Metropolitan Correctional Center, 129th Street, Brooklyn. The handwriting was unmistakably Nolan's, the sloped, deliberate script that mirrored Rue's the penmanship she'd taught him at age 7 at the kitchen table with the same patience she'd brought to everything from homework to moral instruction. I held the envelope by its edges, resisted tearing it open on the asphalt, walked back up the gravel path, and stood a moment beneath the bare apple tree mist lifting November air sharp enough to sting any exposed skin. I went inside, brewed a fresh pot, filled 2 cups from muscle memory built across 30 years. One for me. One for the ghost of a morning ritual. Rue had started back when Nolan was learning to write in that same sloped hand. I sat at the wooden table, the same one where Nadia had served pot roast 6 weeks ago, the same one where Rue had taught both children cursive before schools stopped treating handwriting as worth the time. I opened the envelope with a kitchen knife, careful, deliberate, the way I'd opened evidence packages for 3 decades. Inside, a single sheet of standard institutional stationery, 3 paragraphs in his hand. I recognized it without needing a reference. No greeting, no dear dad, no formal opening, just careful accounting. The first paragraph described his days at the Metropolitan Correctional Center: wake time, meal schedule, recreation hour, lights out. Institutional rhythm. Anyone who'd spent time in federal custody would recognize at a glance. No complaints, no requests, just documentation. The second paragraph covered his attorney, dedicated counsel, per material witness. Cooperation plea, negotiations underway, testimony, deposition, set for mid-November. A USA BASCOM, managing the cooperation timeline. The third paragraph was shorter. Nadia had forwarded him her message about their mother's account. He'd read it 17 times. Didn't have a response that didn't land as deflection or excuse, so he wasn't offering one. Just acknowledged that he'd seen it and understood what it meant. Then a final line, a question. Do you still have the apple tree? I set the letter on the kitchen table, looked out the window at bare November branches traced against a gray morning sky. The same tree he'd climbed at age 7. The same tree I'd stood beneath 20 minutes earlier holding his envelope. The same tree I'd watched through this window 6 weeks ago, telling myself I wanted to live long enough to see him sit under its shade again. The letter sat on the same table where Rue had taught him to hold a pen. That was enough. I didn't know what I was measuring. Forgiveness, reconciliation, survival, hope, some combination, or none of them. But the ledger between us wasn't empty. It never would be. I picked the letter back up. Read through it fully. It had begun with 2 words I hadn't been expecting. Dad, I'm sorry. Not dear Dad. No formal institutional preamble. Direct acknowledgement. The handwriting was Nolan's Rue's sloped, precise script inherited across a generation. Dad, I don't know the entry point, so I'll state it. I'm sorry. Not because the wire was blocked, because I put Mom's SSN on routing lines. I didn't think, or rather I made an active choice not to evaluate. You drilled that into me. Choosing not to evaluate reality is the first real crime. Your audit was correct. Nolan wasn't apologizing for getting caught. He was apologizing for what had been done to Rue's identity and acknowledging the principle I'd planted in him at 16. Willful blindness is the foundation crime that makes all the others possible. The letter went on. The attorney says that based on my material disclosures regarding Maddox's Frankfurt accounts, the judge is prepared to sign a 5 to 7 year plea rather than the statutory maximum. There are long hours here to look at numbers. Do you still have the apple tree, Nolan? P.S. Can you send a box of books? Nothing to read on this block. 5 to 7 years. Material witness cooperation reducing exposure from decades to less than 1. Nolan would be 39 when he walked out 40 at maximum, young enough to rebuild, old enough to carry what reconstruction cost. The postscript hit differently than the apology. A practical request: books for federal detention where recreation meant an institutional library stocked with donated volumes from 1964. I called Nadia on Tuesday evening by video. She answered from her Minneapolis apartment, elementary education materials on the shelf behind her teaching certificates, classroom management texts, children's literature she used for lesson planning. I need your guidance on literary selection, I said. Nadia laughed. A clean, unguarded sound I hadn't heard since before July, when the SEC discovery had arrived and Nolan stopped returning her calls. You're asking an elementary educator to curate an inmate reading list. Healing measured not in apologies but in returning frequencies. He asked for books, I said. I'm asking which ones matter. 40 minutes of back and forth followed. Nadia pushed for contemporary fiction, Steinbeck-Morrison voices that worked through moral complexity without institutional framing. I countered with financial histories, structural chronicles of Wall Street texts that would hand Nolan a vocabulary for understanding the machine that had nearly consumed him. Neither of us yielded easily. Both of us were glad to have the argument. We landed on a compromise: historical fiction tracking family lineage across generations, a Wall Street institutional chronicle covering the 1985 collapse, and the father-son biography Judge Alton Greer had given me 2 winters ago, still on my shelf with the dust jacket unbroken. Send the biography, Nadia said. Father-son accountability. You never opened it. Maybe he will. I sealed the cardboard box Wednesday morning, addressed it in heavy black ink, Metropolitan Correctional Center, 129th Street. Brooklyn dropped it at the post office, watched the clerk scan the label and route it into processing. Late November brought frost and stripped branches. I stood on grass white with cold beneath Rue's apple tree on a Monday morning. Branches entirely bare. November air sharp enough to cut exposed skin. A steaming mug in my hand, first of 2 cups I still brewed from habit. No case watch directory running. IRS database deactivated. The investigation completely closed. 0 operational objectives for the first time in 14 months. My phone vibrated. Text from a Brooklyn prefix. Dad, box cleared security. Just finished the first volume. Thank you, S. I took a slow sip of coffee. Looked up at gray sky through the bare branches. Slid the phone into my coat pocket. Stayed standing on the frost-covered grass. Coffee still warm against the cold air. The tree had let go of everything. But Rue had told me once 20 years ago, standing in this same yard watching October work on the branches, that a tree dropping its leaves wasn't dying. It was consolidating resources for what came next. I hadn't believed her. The stripped branches had read to me as termination, institutional mindset classifying assets as operational or finished, no third category recognized. But Rue had understood probability better than I did. She'd spent 30 years teaching children who needed frameworks with room to accommodate growth rather than enforce certainty. The tree isn't dying, she'd said, just consolidating. Come April, you'll see. I'd watched April arrive year after year since her death. Bare branches pushing new growth through frost-hardened bark despite every reason not to. Every morning I still brewed enough coffee to fill 2 mugs. 30 years of marriage had made it reflex. Rue took hers black with 1 sugar. Mine went straight. For 5 years the second cup had sat untouched, poured cold into the sink when it no longer held any heat. A ritual without anyone to receive it. But standing under that bare tree, with Nolan's text glowing on my phone and November frost snapping beneath my shoes, I felt something had changed. The second cup was no longer a foregone conclusion, no longer guaranteed to go to waste. It had become a probability. No name attached to whoever might one day claim it. No timeline for their return, no paper trail confirming the ritual would ever serve its original purpose again. Just probability, a fragile arithmetic chance that the ledger between father and son, between what had been lost and what might yet be recovered, could tip toward balance rather than permanent deficit. I stood beneath that bare apple tree holding 2 cups of coffee, one empty one, waiting. For 32 years I had audited certainties, tax fraud, wire transfers, categorical violations. That night under the apple tree holding 2 cups of coffee, I wasn't a retired federal agent anymore. I was just a father standing at the edge of something I couldn't undo. What this cost me is hard to put into a single word. It cost me the version of my son I had chosen to believe in. It cost me the clean story, the one where grief and loyalty point in the same direction. I believe God places certain reckonings in front of us not to break us, but to show us what we are actually made of. The ledger doesn't always balance the way we hope. But it does balance. That I learned. If these grandpa revenge stories and father stories have taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. First, trust is not a feeling. It is a pattern. Verify the pattern before you protect the person. Second, the people who count on your blind spots are counting on you never to examine them. Examine them anyway. Third, when someone hands you a deadline meant to make you panic, slow down. Panic is the weapon. Time is yours. Fourth, loyalty to family does not mean loyalty to what a family member has done. You can love someone and still refuse to stand between them and the consequences they built. If this story reached you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. A father, a son, anyone carrying something heavy they haven't named yet. Leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so the next story finds you. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. Take care of yourself and I'll see you in the next chapter.